Chapter 114. Since Poison Fong was able to pry information about the energy ores from the captives, then they must know how the 6th Division discovered the energy ores. In other words, they must know about Silin and Hui Mao. If the energy ores were enough to attract the Skeleton King and Carreño, then Silin's value would also enter Carreño's eyes. After the space plane landed on the planet, De Bienzi and a few other Poison Fong people surrounded Silin in the middle, not allowing him to make any small movements. Silin looked around. Judging from the situation, this planet's habitability was also rank B. It was not easy to find a rank B planet in Sector Z. But judging from the surrounding buildings, it was obvious that this planet had been Poison Fong's stronghold for quite some time. Not long after he got off the space plane, Silin had to pass through a device that looked like a door frame before he reached the exit. Silin had seen this kind of device in many places in other sectors before, and it was a device used to inspect subspace containers. After the device was turned on, the center of the device became distorted and blurry. Silin stepped onto it, and while he was passing through the device let out beeping sounds. At the same time, a display screen at the side displayed the location of the spatial anomaly. After Silin passed through the device, De Bienzi walked forward. This time, however, he did not use his gun. Instead, he said with a fake smile, "Be tactful and hand it over." Expressionlessly, Silin took off a ring from his wrist and tossed it to De Bienzi. De Bienzi flipped a switch on the ring and poured out the contents inside. Looking at the food and water bottles scattered on the ground, De Bienzi let out a tisk and stomped on the compressed food. He even crushed it a couple of times. However, he kicked the water bottle to the person beside him. If there was no problem with the test, then he could use it. De Bienzi nudged Silin. "Test again." Silin also cooperated with him. The second test did not detect any abnormalities. "Let's go," De Bienzi called out to the people around him, and together they brought Silin to where Carreño was. At the same time, no one noticed that a small metal protrusion at the bottom of the aircraft, which looked similar to its surroundings, slowly moved. It quietly slipped out and stuck to the bottom of another aircraft that was preparing to take off. When the aircraft took off, this small protrusion released some translucent sesame-sized balls. It was difficult to see them unless one looked carefully. The people at the port did not notice the small balls rolling along with the dust. They were still laughing and talking about the scene of a certain massacre. Silin was brought to a 20-meter-tall building. It wasn't grand, but it was definitely unique. The color of the building was blood red, and there were some large Poison Fong emblems hanging on the pillars. There were 3 people who had been skinned alive and nailed to the pillars outside the hall. They were still breathing, but they were not far from death. This was definitely torture. Beside these 3 bloody people were their uniforms. They were the uniforms of the 6th Division. One of them was a combatant, and the other 2 were a technician. Silin had an impression of everyone he met before. These 3 people were the subordinates of Akai and Huaqin, the 2 vice-captains. De Bienzi and the Poison Fong members around him let out proud chuckles. Silin picked up a few broken stones from the ground and shot them at the 3 people before De Bienzi and the others could react. Death was always better than living a life worse than death. De Bienzi and the people around him raised their guns at Silin in unison, but Silin acted as if he knew nothing. He turned to De Bienzi and said, "Continue to lead the way." De Bienzi narrowed his eyes, wrinkled his nose, and let out a beast-like growl. However, he quickly calmed down. "Don't get too full of yourself, kid. When the time comes, I'll skin you and nail you to the ground, slice by slice, and feed you to my cute pets." Silin said that he had been acting very calm all this time. He didn't pretend to be a trembling coward, because that would only be deceiving himself. Poison Fong might be crazy, but they weren't a bunch of idiots. How could a person sent by the 6th Division be a cowardly piece of trash? In the end, it would only backfire and arouse even more suspicion. Although Silin had only seen Carreño through that video, Silin had a feeling that Carreño was the kind of person who would dig out the secrets at the bottom of your heart the deeper you hid them. This was Silin's hope as well. After all, this way, he would be able to better develop according to Silin's arrangements. "Welcome to my kingdom," At the top of the great hall, Carreño sat there and looked down at Scylla, who was walking in step by step. As he spoke, his two pairs of fangs protruded outwards, making him look even more ferocious. Scylla looked at Carreño, who was sitting high above. I'm very happy to be able to meet the legendary Skeleton King with my own eyes. I believe that Skeleton King has done his research on me already. So, shall we get straight to the point? Carreño smiled and pointed at a chair a few steps away from Scylla. There's no rush. Sit first. There was a giant spider under Carreño's hand. Carreño's hand was placed on the spider's back, but it didn't seem to cover even a fifth of the spider's back. There was also an unknown animal lying at Carreño's feet. It had many pairs of legs, its body was covered in a layer of fine scales, and its tail was curled up. Two pairs of eyes, one big and one small, were staring at Scylla with a murderous glint in their eyes. This should be a native species of this planet. Scylla had just sat down when he said, I can tell you more about the energy ores, but I wish to meet my companions and confirm if they are still alive. Carreño looked to be in a good mood as he turned his head and spoke to a few poison fong people beside him. Scylla frowned at them. These people were not conversing in the language of the League of Stars. Scylla lost count of how many times he had frowned ever since he came here. The poison fong people were very happy to see Scylla's behavior. Carreño was conversing with the people in Sector V's language. After giving the order, Carreño looked at Scylla again. I heard that you have a talking cat that can find energy ores. After learning about Huimao from the captives, Carreño had planned to attack the 6th Division again and capture Huimao. However, he received the news that the person who came this time was Scylla while he was planning. It had to be said that this was news that excited Carreño. According to the information he knew, the talking Huimao that could find energy ores belonged to Scylla. If he could trap Scylla here, then it would be much easier to capture the cat. Scylla nodded, yes, but I didn't bring it with me this time. While he was speaking, a poison fong member carried a person into the room and threw the person to the ground. The person who was thrown to the ground had his hands and feet cuffed and his mouth sealed. He looked like he hadn't caught his breath yet, and his eyes were a little unfocused. But when he recovered and saw Scylla's figure clearly, he struggled to get up, only to be kicked back to the ground by someone beside him. When Scylla saw this person, he immediately stood up from his chair and quickly walked to his side and crouched down. Vice Captain Joaquin, how are you? When Carreño saw that Scylla had clearly let out a sigh of relief after checking Joaquin's physical condition, he stroked the giant spider's back and smiled. Two pairs of fangs protruded out of his mouth. King, why did you summon me here? It was at this moment a young man walked in. Chapter 115. The newcomer looked to be about 26 or 27 years old. He was an average human with long bangs and no tattoos. However, there were a lot of miniature instruments on his body. Even if he didn't know what they were for, Scylla knew that they were very threatening. Although the young man also addressed Carreño as king, his tone was not as fearful and reserved as Debienzi's. Instead, it sounded a little more casual. However, it seemed that the rest of Poison Fong were already used to this young man's tone and style. Even Carreño himself did not express anything and simply looked at the newcomer with a smile. Oh, Mouse, come here quickly. I'll show you something. Carreño smiled until his two pairs of fangs were protruding. He waved his hand and pointed at a chair, gesturing for El Mouse to sit down first. The chair Carreño pointed at was closer to the throne than Scylla's. However, El Mouse did not go over immediately. Instead, he examined Scylla from head to toe for a moment before leisurely strolling to the chair and sitting down casually. He crossed his legs and looked at Scylla and the others with interest. Footsteps came from outside. Before his subordinates could report, Carreño said loudly, "Come in." A dozen or so people came in after him. The three leaders should be about the same status as Debienzi. After bowing to the Skeleton King, they sat down beside Debienzi. Scylla could tell that they were not pure-blooded humans. It made sense. Sector V was a chaotic place with a lot of people, and there wasn't a stable social system or group distribution either. It wasn't strange for multiple races to live together like this. The few Poison Fong people who came in behind the three people carried the energy ores boxes and placed them at the center of the hall. Then, They retreated to the back and stood still. Unlike the others, small fries like them did not dare to sit carelessly without the king's permission. The people who came in all carried a lot of weapons on them. There were ranged weapons, melee weapons, and even suicide weapons. El Mouse's eyes lit up as he scanned the boxes that hadn't been opened yet. The instrument on his body had already sensed something. Haha, El Mouse can't wait any longer. Debienzi laughed. Carreño moved his fingers, signaling the people standing behind him to open the box. As the box was opened, black, red, green, white, and transparent ores shone out, causing everyone to be unable to take their eyes off them. El Mouse even jumped up from his chair and circled around the energy ores. His eyes were burning with passion, as though he had seen his lover. Good stuff. El Mouse touched the energy ore inside. Debienzi and the others couldn't hold themselves back either. They got up and touched the energy ores, wishing they could just hold them in their hands. Lying on the ground, Joaquin's eyes widened as he stared at Celine in disbelief. Then he looked at the energy ores inside the boxes, closed his eyes, and shook his head. He understood that these energy ores were for them, but Joaquin knew Poison Fang's intentions even better. These people had no intention of letting them go at all. Even if Celine was the one who delivered the energy ores, he wouldn't be able to leave alive. The word trust did not exist in Poison Fang's dictionary. They only believed in possession and slaughter. My king, these energy ores are different from the ones we usually use. A person next to Debienzi touched the energy ores left and right, looking very excited. Of course. Carreño laughed twice and turned to look at Celine. In order for everyone to understand these energy ores better, I'll have the discoverer of these energy ores, Vanguard Division 6 Celine, explain them to everyone. Joaquin abruptly opened his eyes and stared straight at Celine with an aura that said, if you dare say anything, I'll fight you to the death. Celine flashed a smile at Joaquin. Vice Captain Joaquin, don't worry, nothing will happen. Don't worry my ass, nothing will happen. Joaquin was panicking inside. These energy ores should not have been revealed to these Poison Fang people, even if they had to sacrifice all 30 or so of their captives, not to mention that they had already moved all the energy ores here. Joaquin was already regretting his actions enough, and you actually want to explain them to them? Joaquin comforted himself that Celine was probably using some sort of tactic, and that the information he revealed was probably fake. At the very least, he had managed to fool Poison Fang. But to Joaquin's disappointment, the contents of Celine's first words nearly caused him to lose his breath and faint. This bastard is actually telling the truth. As expected, he's still inexperienced and naive. Why did the captain send this kid over? Joaquin was whimpering on the spot. His mouth was sealed, and Celine hadn't torn off the seal on his mouth just now. Right now, Joaquin was squirming and whimpering on the spot. On the other hand, Celine was talking excitedly, spittle flying all over the place. It was absolutely brilliant. He had never spoken so much even when he was in the 6th Squad. While Debienzi was stretching his neck to listen to Celine's explanation, he felt that his leg was a little itchy. He scratched it casually before continuing to listen to Celine's explanation. At the same time, the big spider under Carreño's hand noticed many small, translucent balls rolling towards it. These small balls gave it a very bad feeling, but at the same time, it felt that they should be quite delicious. This was a kind of contradictory psychology. Just as the spider was hesitating, these small balls rolled onto its body and stuck to its antennae. While the native beast under Carreño's feet was snoring, the small balls rolled into its mouth one after another. Some of them were inhaled as it breathed. Carreño was engrossed in listening, and he was still imagining just how powerful a weapon powered by these energy ores would be. But to his surprise, the big spider under his palm suddenly moved greatly and escaped from under Carreño's palm. In just a few moments, it had scurried off to God knows where. If this was any other time, Carreño would have sent people to look for it. But now he was not in the mood to do so. Right now, almost all of his attention was diverted to the things that Celine was talking about, because these energy ores could satisfy his ambition. The contents of Celine's explanation were easy to understand. Carreño already knew some of the information from the captives, but there were some small details that Scylla added that made Carreño even happier. For example, Scylla said that the black and red energy ores could also stimulate some organisms to produce hard scales on the surface of their bodies. Every time an energy ore was introduced, Scylla would give some examples of its application. Although there were some things that Carreño had already imagined, the contents of Scylla's explanation were like paintings that had been colored more vivid and more attractive. Moreover, Carreño was convinced that what Scylla said was true. Therefore, following Scylla's explanation, the Watching's face became more and more ashen, while the Bienzi and the others became more and more excited. Emaus was still reaching out to touch the energy ores. His long bangs covered his eyes, making it impossible to see his expression clearly. Chapter 116. After Scylla was done, Emus and Scylla went on to discuss a few formulas and parameters. In fact, the two of them even got into an argument over one of the parameters in the formula. The Bienzi and the others knew about examples, but they were definitely illiterate when it came to things like formulas and parameters. Before Elmaus and Scylla could talk for long, someone beside the Bienzi shouted, "Elmaus, you're just looking for a beating, aren't you? Why do you keep talking nonsense? Just be as simple and straightforward as possible." Elmaus was not angry. He ignored the person and turned back to continue his discussion with Scylla. Sitting at the high seat, Skeleton King was still smiling and did not stop Elmaus. Even if Carreño himself did not understand, it was fine as long as Elmaus understood, wasn't it? Elmaus was an excellent weapon modifier and the absolute best in Poison Fong's technical team. Since Elmaus came to Poison Fong, he had created a lot of good weapons for them. This was also one of the reasons why Poison Fong could run amok in Sector V without fear of the army, the hunter regiments, and the great families of the League of Stars. Therefore, the more Elmaus discussed and understood, the more the modified weapons would not disappoint Carreño. Ahem, Skeleton King, is there any water here? Scylla stopped his discussion and looked at Skeleton King. His gaze seemed to be saying, "I've been talking for more than an hour already, and you're so stingy that you can't even bring out a glass of water?" When he heard that Scylla wanted to drink water, the Bienzi and the others also felt a little thirsty, probably because they were too excited about the energy ores just now. Carreño clapped his hands and specially asked someone to prepare fruit tea. The fruit used to make the tea was a native plant of this planet. Scylla picked up the cup and looked at the blood-red liquid inside. He sniffed and found that there was a herbaceous fragrance. "This tea is pretty good," Scylla said after taking a sip. "Actually, you can drink it often." Carreño seemed to be implying something. Scylla smiled. "I'll return after I complete this mission." It was a tactful refusal. Lying on the ground, the Watching sighed on the inside. How insensible. He was young after all, and he shouldn't have said something like this. If he said it, his last chance of survival would be gone. He should have taken a roundabout way. After drinking the fruit tea, Scylla continued his discussion with Elmaus. Just now, Elmaus seemed to be completely focused on the energy ores and didn't drink the fruit tea at all. Seeing that Scylla and Elmaus had started discussing profound issues again, the Bienzi and the others were scratching their heads. He didn't know if it was an illusion, but the Bienzi felt a little suffocated. However, he attributed the reason to Scylla and Elmaus's discussion. The Bienzi thought, as long as you know how to use guns and fly fighter jets, it's fine. What's the point of understanding so many profound issues? The Bienzi despised Elmaus in his heart. This kind of person only knew how to hide in the back. All he did was fiddle with a few new weapons. Wasn't he just a piece of trash on the battlefield? After the discussion was over, Elmaus took out his personal dagger. These daggers weren't high-energy density cutting tools, but were forged from a special alloy mixed in a certain ratio. They were used to cut energy ores in a small area. This was what technicians liked to use because this kind of dagger wouldn't consume too much energy from the energy ores. It looked like Elmaus was a very professional talent. Elmaus first cut off a small piece from the red-black energy ores and dragged it up with the dagger. His freed finger darkened the device, covering his other arm, and popped out a semicircular object. There was even a small notch inside it. Elmaus placed the cut energy piece into the notch and closed the notch. Then he took out the semicircular object and placed it in the empty space at the center of the hall. He pressed a button on top of the semicircular object, and a red-black energy shield immediately enveloped the semicircular object. Scylla raised an eyebrow. This object was indeed intricate, as expected of a professional. No wonder Shotten said that Poison Fong's equipment was very good. It would be strange if such a talent wasn't well equipped. Not to mention, there should be more than one such talent in Poison Fong. De Bienzi and the others very consciously retreated. Elmouse operated the device on his arm again and popped out a launcher. A white light bullet struck the semicircular object, but the semicircular object wasn't damaged in the slightest. Sitting on the high seat, Carreño's eyes lit up. De Bienzi and the others also couldn't help but take a step forward. Elmouse pressed another button on his arm and popped out another 4 launchers. There were 5 launchers in total, and each launcher could fire 3 shots in a row. 15 light bullets struck the semicircular object, but the semicircular object remained intact. Nice! Carreño couldn't help but exclaim. The effect of this energy or his energy shield was just too good. De Bienzi and the others moved forward to take a closer look. King, this thing is just too good. Do we have to be afraid of those armies with this? We'll kill them the next time we run into them. That's right. When the time comes, we'll show them the power of our Poison Fong. Carreño calmed his breathing and looked at Elmouse. Let's continue with the rest. Let this king take a good look at the effects of these energy ores. Elmouse nodded and walked to the box containing the green energy ores with his dagger. He was just about to cut it when he heard Scylla murmur beside him. How did this happen? Everyone looked over, and Carreño's pupils shrank. Right now, blood was dripping out of Scylla's nostrils, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't wipe it clean. Both his hands were covered in blood, and there were a few drops on the ground as well. Elmouse stared blankly at Scylla and the blood on the ground. He got up and retreated as if he was avoiding the plague. Carreño had no intention of getting rid of Scylla so quickly at all. At the very least, Scylla was still useful right now, and it wasn't just a small one at that. But who the fuck did it first? Someone, treat him immediately, Carreño roared. Scylla seemed to be scared out of his wits. He pushed away the people who came forward to examine him and started coughing harder and harder. After he covered his mouth and coughed a few times, his hands were covered in blood when he took them away. Other than the blood coming out of his nose, he was also coughing up blood. Scylla staggered 2 steps and sat down weakly beside the box containing the energy ores. He was coughing nonstop as he sat on the ground. De Bienzi and the others were also a little dumbfounded. The guy who looked like he was giving advice and inspiring words just a moment ago now looked like a seriously ill patient who was about to kick the bucket. What on earth happened? What are you waiting for? Roared Carreño as he walked down from his high seat. The examiners hurriedly walked to Scylla's side to perform a preliminary examination. King, he's been poisoned. He's only been poisoned for 2 hours. We'll have to conduct further examinations to determine the specific situation. Then let's examine him. Carreño's body was filled with murderous intent as he glanced at the people in the hall. 2 hours. Scylla should have been brought here 2 hours ago, but he might have been poisoned before he arrived. Who was the one who poisoned him? King, that captive, exclaimed de Bienzi. Carreño looked over and saw that Joaquin, who was lying on the ground, was also beginning to spasm. Blood was flowing out of his nostrils. He was probably coughing too, but his mouth was sealed, so more blood was coming out his nose. What on earth happened? I keep feeling like I can't breathe. Me too. While de Bienzi and the others were talking, Carreño suddenly felt a sense of danger. He instantly exerted force on his feet, and a deep depression appeared on the ground. At the same time, Carreño quickly retreated, but he was still too slow. His arms, legs, and back were all shot. De Bienzi and the others were not so lucky. They were shot in the head and chest, and all of them were fatal wounds. Someone actually shot them from behind. Who was it? Apart from the captive lying on the ground and Scylla sitting on the ground, there should be no outsiders here. There was no one, unless, yes, there was a person who could fire so many bullets at the same time without making a sound and hit their targets at the same time. Emmaus, you traitor. Chapter 117. De Bienzi and the others had never thought that Elmaus would shoot them from behind. They had always thought that a person like Elmaus was most suited to hide in the backlands and dabble in technology to create weapons and develop resources for them. To put it bluntly, they never thought that Elmaus would have the courage to shoot them from behind. A person who dabbled in technology, a person who couldn't do anything without formula and parameter calculations, a person who wasn't as tall, strong, or imposing as they were, had actually given them a fatal blow. Where did he get the courage from? Did he not know the consequences of betraying the Skeleton King? There weren't many people in the hall, and Carreño didn't like to place so many guards around him. However, Carreño liked to keep pets, and sometimes he would release his pets to bite someone as punishment. Carreño liked the scene of his cute pets tearing people apart and eating them, and the Poison Fong members around him would either be excited by the sight of blood or fearful. Either way, Carreño liked it. In the past, the pets would rush out the moment there was any unusual movement. Pets were more loyal than humans. But today was different. It was only now that Carreño realized that he had been careless. Although the pets inside the hall wouldn't run out and show themselves, they were still hidden somewhere in the hall. But what about now? He didn't see a single one of them except for the native beast at his feet. No, the native beast was asleep. How could it possibly fall asleep after making such a huge commotion? Perhaps something was very wrong when the spider under his palm ran away. But Carreño had been listening to Sillin enthusiastically at the time. He had even started to make long-term plans in his mind to realize his ambition. In the end, it was still a carelessness. To be able to become the leader of Poison Fong, Carreño was a capable person. Moreover, he never trusted anyone, even subordinates who had followed him for dozens of years. At most, Carreño would regret the loss of a helper if he saw them die. He wouldn't be sad, much less reminisce. Carreño's first thought regarding Elmaus's betrayal wasn't why, but to avoid Elmaus's attack range, as if he had planned it beforehand. He would understand his subordinates first, and then he would be on guard. Carreño was always on guard against the people around him. So even if Carreño had walked down from his high position, he wouldn't enter anyone's best point of attack. This was also one of the reasons why he was able to avoid being hit in vital areas. Carreño had activated his protective shield while he was swiftly retreating to a place closer to the head seat. Then, he raised a metal wall to separate the head seat area from the area below the hall. Elmaus knew that he wouldn't get a second chance if he didn't end Carreño just now. Given Carreño's wariness, he must have arranged many escape routes. Right now, Carreño should have retreated from the hall and gathered the people outside to prepare to attack the hall. That was why Elmaus didn't chase after him. Instead, he pressed a few buttons on the device on his arm before the people outside rushed in. A beam of light shot out from the center of the hemispherical protective shield and swiftly spread to the surroundings, forming a hemispherical shield that enveloped the people inside the hall. Not satisfied with just this bit of protection, Emuse threw out another 3 semi-spheres in quick succession. Using his dagger, Emuse skillfully cut out a few small pieces from the red-black energy ores and installed them within. He then proceeded with the second, third, and fourth layer of protection and reinforcement. This series of actions was completed in an extremely short amount of time. By the time the people outside realized that something was wrong and rushed in, 4 layers of protective shields had already been raised. The red-black energy shield enveloped the entire hall tightly. Moreover, the energy used was special, so the people outside really couldn't do anything about it for a while. Carreño had probably already begun to gather people to make arrangements for the aftermath. For traitors, Carreño wouldn't show the slightest bit of mercy. Of course, Carreño wouldn't show mercy to anyone. All right, based on the current situation, there shouldn't be any problems within half an hour. But after half an hour, it's hard to say. Carreño must be mobilizing heavy weaponry right now. In order to destroy us, he definitely won't care about razing this place to the ground. Elmaus said, while leaning against the box containing the energy ores. There were only the 3 of them inside the energy shield. Be it Huaqin or Sillin, Elmaus wouldn't turn his back to them. Sillin, who looked like a dying man just a moment ago, slowly stood up and wiped the blood under his nose as if nothing had happened. Now that the blood had stopped flowing, he looked even more normal than a normal person. The same was true for Joaquin, who was lying on the ground. His breathing slowly recovered, and he looked puzzledly at Sillin and the poison fong trader. What on earth was going on? Sillin took out a gun and fired 3 shots at Joaquin. The 3 bullets hit the same spot, and the handcuffs broke with a clang. After recovering, Joaquin moved his limp hands and caught the gun Sillin threw at him. He broke the handcuffs on his feet and tore open the seal on his mouth. He grimaced in pain. Poison Fong probably didn't plan to tear open the seal for him at all. The seal they used was one that was almost glued to his skin. El Mouse's eyelids twitched when Sillin took out a gun. He didn't even see where Sillin took out the gun at all. The most depressing thing was that El Mouse still couldn't see where Sillin took out another gun after tossing it to Joaquin. Although Sillin had blocked the gun with his body, he should have done something to take out a gun, right? But in reality, El Mouse didn't see any extra movement from Sillin at all. He just casually raised his hand, and the gun was already in his hand. El Mouse was very puzzled. Logically speaking, Sillin must have gone through many layers of inspection before he was escorted here. But this person was actually carrying more than one gun after the inspection. That was why El Mouse raised Sillin's danger level to a whole new level. Sillin looked at El Mouse, but did not raise his gun. Instead, he stared at El Mouse indifferently and asked why. Sillin didn't think that Poison Fong would do something like this. He had only changed his plan halfway through. After he finished his fruit tea, Emus introduced a secret code to Sillin when he was discussing formulas and parameters with Emus. It was a secret code that only a portion of professional technicians could understand, and after combining the secret code, Sillin received news that Emus was about to make his move. Sillin also changed his plan slightly, and this was also why he was sitting down with his back against the energy ores. Those energy ores could block light bullets, and Sillin wouldn't completely trust Emus. He didn't want to be accidentally injured. El Mouse shrugged. I want to get myself a way out and some time to explain. In order to avoid being toyed to death by Sillin like de Bienzi and the others, El Mouse had pulled himself away in time and expressed that he would take care of de Bienzi and the others before Sillin took action. Before the fruit tea, El Mouse already knew that this person who was even younger than him had started his revenge a long time ago. If he hadn't installed a special device on his body, he definitely wouldn't have sensed the things that had unknowingly entered his body in that kind of situation. No wonder Sillin had spoken so brilliantly at the time. It wasn't because Sillin was too naive, it was because he wanted to attract their attention. Even if he was suspicious of the kid's intentions at the time, he had to admit that Sillin's explanation of these energy ores was very attractive and could evoke the ambition in people's hearts. It was no wonder that Carreño would be careless. Which way? Sillin asked. El Mouse smiled. If I tell you the truth, can you get those things out of my body? I can. After giving Sillin a serious look and knowing that Sillin was telling the truth, El Mouse made a gesture that all the hunters knew very well. Seeing El Mouse's gesture, the Joaquin who had just managed to stand up felt cold sweat pour down his back. Chapter 118. De Bienzi and the others had never thought that El Mouse would shoot them from behind. They had always thought that a person like El Mouse was most suited to hide in the backlands and dabble in technology, creating weapons, and developing resources for them. To put it bluntly, they never thought that El Mouse would have the courage to shoot them from behind. A person who dabbled in technology, a person who could never do anything without formulas and parameter calculations, a person who was not as tall, strong, or imposing as they were, had actually delivered a fatal blow to them. Where did he get the courage from? Did he not know the consequences of betraying the Skeleton King? There weren't many people in the hall, and Carreño did not like to place so many guards around him. However, Carreño liked to keep pets, and sometimes he would release his pets to bite someone as punishment. Carreño liked the scene of his cute pets tearing people apart and eating them. The Poison Fong members around him were either excited by the sight of blood or fearful of it. Either way, Carreño liked it. In the past, the pets would rush out the moment there was an unusual disturbance. Pets are more loyal than humans. But today was different. It was only now that Carreño realized that he had been careless. Although the pets inside the hall would not run out and show themselves, they were still hidden somewhere in the hall. But what about now? He didn't see a single one of them except for the native beast at his feet. No, the native beast was asleep. How could it fall asleep after making such a huge commotion? Perhaps something was very wrong when the spider under his palm ran away, but Carreño had been listening to Scylla enthusiastically at the time. He had even started making long-term plans in his mind to realize his ambition. In the end, he was still careless. To be able to become the leader of Poison Fong, Carreño was a capable person. Moreover, he had never trusted anyone. Even subordinates who had followed him for dozens of years, Carreño would at most regret the loss of a helper if they died. He would not mourn or remember them. The first thing that came to Carreño's mind when it came to Emu's betrayal was not why, but to avoid Emu's attack range as if he had planned it beforehand. He would always understand his subordinates, and after understanding them, he would be on guard. No matter what, Carreño would always be on guard against those around him. Therefore, even if Carreño were to step down from his high position, he would never enter anyone's optimal attack point. This was also one of the reasons why he was able to avoid being hit in vital areas. Carreño had activated his protective shield while he was swiftly retreating to a place closer to the head seat. Then, he raised a metal wall to separate the head seat area from the area below the hall. El Mouse knew that he would not get a second chance if he did not end Carreño just now. Given Carreño's wariness, he must have arranged many escape routes. Right now, Carreño should have retreated from the hall and gathered the people outside to prepare to attack the hall. That was why El Mouse did not chase after him. Instead, he pressed a few buttons on the device on his arm before the people outside rushed in. A beam of light shot out from the center of the hemispherical protective shield and swiftly spread to the surroundings, forming a hemispherical shield that enveloped the people inside the hall. That was not enough. 3 more hemispherical shields flew out one after another, and El Mouse used his dagger to cut out a few small pieces from the red-black energy ores in a practiced manner. He installed them into the ores and reinforced them a second, a third, and a fourth time. This series of actions was completed in an extremely short period of time. By the time the people outside realized that something was wrong and rushed in, 4 layers of protective shields had already been raised. The red-black energy shield enveloped the hall tightly. Moreover, the energy ores used were special, so the people outside really could not do anything about it for a while. Carreño had probably already begun to gather people to arrange the follow-up matters. For traitors, Carreño would not show the slightest bit of mercy. Of course, Carreño would show mercy to anyone. All right, based on the current situation, there should be no problems within half an hour. But after half an hour, it's hard to say. Carreño must be mobilizing heavy weaponry right now. In order to destroy us, he definitely won't care about razing this place to the ground. El Mouse said while leaning against the box containing the energy ores. There were only the 3 of them inside the energy shield. Be it Joaquin or Scylla, El Mouse would not turn his back to them. Scylla, who looked like a dying man just a moment ago, slowly stood up and wiped the blood under his nose as if nothing had happened. Now that the blood had stopped flowing, he looked even more normal than a normal person. The same was true for Joaquin, who was lying on the ground. His breathing slowly recovered, and he looked puzzledly at Scylla and the Poison Fong traitor. What on earth was going on? Scylla took out a gun and fired 3 shots at Joaquin. The 3 bullets hit the same spot, and the handcuffs broke with a clang. After recovering, Joaquin moved his limp hands and caught the gun Scylla had tossed at him. He broke the handcuffs on his feet and tore open the seal on his mouth. He grimaced in pain. Poison Fong probably didn't plan to tear open the seal for him at all. The seal they used was the kind that was almost glued to his skin. El Mouse's eyelids twitched when Scylla took out a gun. He didn't even see where Scylla had pulled out the gun. The most depressing thing was that El Mouse still couldn't see where Scylla had pulled out another gun after tossing it to Joaquin. Although Scylla had moved sideways to block the gun, he should have done something to pull out a gun, right? But in reality, El Mouse didn't see any extra movements from Scylla at all. He just casually raised his hand, and the gun was already in his hand. El Mouse was very puzzled. Logically speaking, Scylla must have gone through many layers of inspection before he was escorted here. But this person was actually carrying more than one gun after the inspection. That was why El Mouse raised Scylla's danger level to a whole new level. Scylla looked at El Mouse but did not raise his gun. Instead, he stared at El Mouse indifferently and asked, "Why?" Scylla didn't think that Poison Fong would actually do something like this. He had only changed his plan halfway through. After he finished his fruit tea, Emus introduced a secret code to Scylla when he was discussing formulas and parameters with Emus. It was a secret code that only a portion of professional technicians could understand, and after combining the secret code, Scylla received news that Emus was about to make his move. Scylla also changed his plan slightly, and this was also why he was sitting down with his back against the energy ores. Those energy ores could block light bullets, and Scylla wouldn't completely trust Emus. He didn't want to be accidentally injured. El Mouse shrugged. "I want to give myself a way out and some time to explain myself." In order to avoid being toyed to death by Scylla like de Bienzi and the others, El Mouse had pulled himself away in time and expressed that he would take care of de Bienzi and the others before Scylla took action. Before the fruit tea, El Mouse already knew that this person who was even younger than him had begun his revenge a long time ago. If he hadn't been equipped with a special device, he definitely wouldn't have sensed the things that had unknowingly entered his body in that kind of situation. No wonder Scylla had spoken so brilliantly at the time. It wasn't because Scylla was too naive, but because he wanted to attract their attention. Even if he was suspicious of the kid's intentions at the time, he had to admit that Scylla's explanation of these energy ores was very attractive and could evoke a person's ambition. It was no wonder that Carreño would be careless. "Which way?" Scylla asked. El Mouse smiled. "If I tell you the truth, can you get those things out of my body?" "I can." After giving Scylla a serious look and knowing that Scylla was telling the truth, El Mouse made a gesture that all hunters understood very well. Seeing El Mouse's gesture, the Watchin who had just managed to stand up felt cold sweat pour down his back. Chapter 119. De Bienzi and the others had never thought that El Mouse would shoot them from behind. They had always thought that a person like El Mouse was most suited to hide in the backlands and dabble in technology, creating weapons and developing resources for them. To put it bluntly, they never thought that El Mouse would have the courage to shoot them from behind. A person who dabbled in technology, a person who couldn't do anything without formula and parameter calculations, a person who wasn't as tall, strong, or imposing as they were, had actually given them a fatal blow. Where did he get the courage from? Did he not know the consequences of betraying the Skeleton King? There weren't many people in the hall, and Carreño didn't like to place so many guards in the surroundings. However, Carreño liked to raise pets, and sometimes he would release his pets to bite someone as punishment. Carreño liked the scene of his cute pets tearing people apart and eating them. The Poison Fong members around him were either excited by the sight of blood or terrified by it. Either way, Carreño liked it. In the past, the pets would rush out the moment there was an unusual disturbance. Pets were more loyal than humans. But today was different. It was only now that Carreño realized that he had been careless. Although the pets inside the hall wouldn't run out and show themselves, they were still hidden somewhere in the hall. But what about now? He didn't see a single one of them except for the native beast at his feet. No, the native beast was asleep. How could it possibly sleep after making such a huge commotion? Perhaps something was very wrong when the spider under his palm ran away, but Carreño was listening to Scylla enthusiastically at the time. He had even started to make long-term plans in his mind to realize his ambition. In the end, it was still a carelessness. To be able to become the leader of Poison Fong, Carreño was a capable person. Moreover, he never trusted anyone, even subordinates who had followed him for dozens of years. At most, Carreño would regret the loss of a helper if he saw them die. He wouldn't mourn or remember them. The first thing that came to Carreño's mind when it came to Emu's betrayal was not why, but to avoid Emu's attack range as if he had planned it beforehand. He would understand his subordinates, and after understanding them, he would be on guard against them. No matter what, Carreño would always be on guard against those around him. Therefore, even if Carreño were to step down from his high position, he would never enter anyone's optimal attack point. This was also one of the reasons why he was able to avoid being hit in vital areas. Carreño had activated his protective shield while he was swiftly retreating to a place closer to the head seat. Then, he raised a metal wall to separate the head seat area from the area below the hall. El Mouse knew that he wouldn't get a second chance if he didn't end Carreño just now. Given Carreño's wariness, he must have arranged many escape routes. Right now, Carreño should have retreated from the hall and gathered the people outside to prepare to attack the hall. That was why El Mouse didn't chase after him. Instead, he pressed a few buttons on the device on his arm before the people outside rushed in. A beam of light shot out from the center of the hemispherical protective shield and swiftly spread to the surroundings, forming a hemispherical shield that enveloped the people inside the hall. Not satisfied with just this bit of protection, Emus threw out another 3 semi-spheres in quick succession. Then, he used his dagger to swiftly cut out a few small pieces from the red-black energy ores and installed them into the spheres. He then proceeded with the second, third, and fourth layer of protection and reinforcement. This series of actions was completed in an extremely short amount of time. By the time the people outside realized that something was wrong and rushed in, 4 layers of protective shields had already been raised. The red-black energy shield enveloped the entire hall tightly. Moreover, the energy used was special, so the people outside really couldn't do anything about it for a while. Carreño had probably already begun to gather people to make arrangements for the aftermath. For traitors, Carreño wouldn't show the slightest bit of mercy. Of course, Carreño wouldn't show mercy to anyone. All right, based on the current situation, there shouldn't be any problems within half an hour. But after half an hour, it's hard to say. Carreño must be mobilizing heavy weaponry right now. In order to destroy us, he definitely won't care about razing this place to the ground. El Mouse said, while leaning against the box containing the energy ores. There were only the 3 of them inside the energy shield. Be it Joaquin or Sillin, El Mouse wouldn't turn his back to them. Sillin, who looked like a dying man just a moment ago, slowly stood up and wiped the blood under his nose as if nothing had happened. Now that the blood had stopped flowing, he looked even more normal than a normal person. The same was true for Joaquin, who was lying on the ground. His breathing slowly recovered, and he looked puzzledly at Sillin and the poison Fong traitor. What on earth was going on? Sillin took out a gun and fired 3 shots at Joaquin. The 3 bullets hit the same spot, and the handcuffs broke with a clang. After recovering, Joaquin moved his limp hands and caught the gun Sillin threw at him. He broke the handcuffs on his feet and tore open the seal on his mouth. He grimaced in pain. Poison Fong probably didn't plan to tear open the seal for him at all. The seal they used was one that was almost glued to his skin. El Mouse's eyelids twitched when Sillin took out a gun. He didn't even see where Sillin took out the gun. The most depressing thing was that El Mouse still couldn't see where Sillin took out another gun after tossing it to Joaquin. Although Sillin had moved sideways to block the gun, he should have done something to take out a gun, shouldn't he? But in reality, El Mouse didn't see Sillin make any extra movements at all. He just casually raised his hand, and the gun was already in his hand. El Mouse was very puzzled. Logically speaking, Sillin must have gone through many layers of inspection before he was escorted here. But this person was actually carrying more than 1 gun after the inspection. That was why El Mouse raised Sillin's danger level to a whole new level. Sillin looked at El Mouse, but did not raise his gun. Instead, he stared at El Mouse indifferently and asked why. Sillin didn't think that Poison Fong would do something like this. He had only changed his plan halfway through. After drinking fruit tea, El Mouse introduced a secret code when he was discussing the formula and parameters with El Mouse. It was a secret code that only certain professional technicians understood. After combining the secret code, Sillin received news that El Mouse was going to act, and Sillin changed his plan slightly. This was also why he sat down with his back against the energy ores. Those energy ores could block light bullets, and Sillin didn't trust El Mouse completely. He didn't want to be accidentally injured. El Mouse shrugged. I want to give myself a way out and some time to explain myself. In order to avoid being toyed to death by Sillin like the Bienzi and the others, El Mouse had pulled himself away in time and expressed that he would take care of the Bienzi and the others before Scylla took action. Before the fruit tea, Elmouse already knew that this person who was even younger than him had begun his revenge a long time ago. If he hadn't been equipped with a special device, he definitely wouldn't have sensed the things that had unknowingly entered his body under those circumstances. No wonder Scylla had spoken so brilliantly at the time. It wasn't because Scylla was too naive, it was because he wanted to attract their attention. Even if he was suspicious of the kid's intentions at the time, he had to admit that Scylla's explanation of these energy ores was very attractive and could evoke the ambition in people's hearts. It was no wonder that Carreño had been careless. "Which way?" Scylla asked. Elmouse smiled. "If I tell you the truth, can you get those things out of my body?" "I can." After giving Scylla a serious look, Elmouse knew that Scylla was telling the truth. He made a gesture that all hunters understood very well. Seeing Elmouse's gesture, the Watchin who had just managed to stand up felt cold sweat pour down his back. Chapter 120. Two Poison Fong members leaned against a fighter jet and talked to each other with guns in their hands. Another 2 fighter jets landed. The people inside walked out and joined the discussion. "That son of a bitch throwing bombs everywhere still hasn't been found." "Not yet. I've been scolded by the boss a few times today. I heard that Quofu and the others were killed." Quofu was de Bienzi's name. "Yeah, they were ambushed by that son of a bitch," Emmaus. While they were chatting, one of them suddenly turned around and looked behind him. "What's wrong?" The person beside him asked. "I feel like I'm being watched." "TSH, you're scared by today's events, aren't you?" "Maybe the man screamed. Something crawled into my body." Then he let out a few more screams. He felt a sharp pain in his body. The 3 people beside him noticed a small bloody hole on his back. They were about to say something when they suddenly felt stabbing pain on their back and abdomen. When they looked closely, they found that they were all the same bloody holes. "Fuck, what is it?" "It hurts like hell." The people nearby heard the noise and came over. Then, more and more people screamed in pain. Their arms, thighs, shoulders, necks, anything that was exposed had been crawled. Some of them had been greatly stimulated by the Bienzi and the others. Now that something like this was happening, they thought that the worms were about to crawl out of their bodies. They were so scared that they almost fell into despair. He was not afraid of death, but he did not want to see himself end up like the Bienzi and the others. He picked up a gun and pointed it at his own head. Bang! Blood sprayed all over the ground. Some people picked up a knife and stabbed at the bloody hole. They stabbed themselves until they were bloody, but they still could not find the thing that crawled into their bodies. Some people pulled the trigger and sprayed the surroundings under the stimulation of intense pain. They did not know where this so-called enemy was, but the sound of gunfire always made them feel a little safer. They did not have the time to care if other people were within their shooting range. They blindly fired aimlessly. Many people died to their comrades' guns in places where there were more people. Panic spread, and chaos began to spread. Scylla watched the situation from a dark corner of a building. The corner of his mouth curled up slightly. "They're here so soon?" A gray shadow flashed by. Huimao jumped on his Scylla's shoulder. "Don't you know who's going to do it?" After Scylla found out the location of the armory, he informed Huimao. Huimao went to intercept the armory, threw a bunch of grenades, and swallowed some things. "Wheeze, why do I feel like you've gotten heavier?" Scylla looked at Huimao, who was licking his claws. "Did I? I didn't feel anything, but I did eat a lot. Other than the energy-absorbing weapon you mentioned, I ate more than half of the things in the armory." Scylla's eyes twitched. "How the hell did this guy eat? How are things in the Scarlet Sand region?" Scylla asked. "The little bugs are starting to come into play. The people guarding the armory don't even have time to care about their weapons. They're howling in pain from being bitten by the little bugs. How is it? I did a good job, right? So. How can it only be SOSO? Huimao raised his claws and patted Scylla's face. "I spread the eggs in more areas than you did, and I rescued the captives safely. Yes, Master Cat. You've worked hard. Did you leave any messages on the aircraft that Akai and the others were on?" Huimao's claws paused as he patted Scylla's face. He then retracted them and curled himself into a ball, not saying a word. That was it. The situation at the time was like this. Since Akai and the others were still unconscious, and Whis couldn't wake them up. It picked them up one by one and loaded them onto the spaceplane. Then, it modified and perfected the spaceplane's navigation program that Cylon spaceplane had copied into the spaceplane's autopilot program. After that, Whis watched the spaceplane fly into the distance while interfering with the other spaceplanes and fighters in the surroundings so that they couldn't lock onto Akai and the other spaceplane. In reality, there were not many spaceplanes or fighters that launched an attack. This was because the spaceplanes were already too high up in the sky by the time they realized that the spaceplanes were not piloted by Poison Fawn. By the time the other fighters reacted, Akai and the others had already flown out of the planet, and Coranio did not give the order to continue the pursuit. Akai and the others were brought onto the aircraft in an unconscious state, and Akai and the others probably did not know the flight path of the aircraft. If they woke up and messed around, they would probably get lost. Cylon had asked Hui Mao to leave a message for them not to mess around after they woke up, but Hui Mao had forgotten about it. All right, then we can only pray that Akai and the others don't wake up too soon. Cylon pulled at Hui Mao's exposed pointy ears. Let's sleep here for a bit. The hunt will begin in 5 hours. The place Cylon had chosen was temporarily free of danger. Even if there was danger, they would be alerted in time. Right now, Poison Fong was in chaos. Everyone's attention was focused on the bird of paradise, and people screaming could be heard everywhere. The people on the aircraft and fighters that were originally in the air did not dare return to the ground. It looked like the situation on the ground was even worse than before. Moreover, they had yet to develop the specialized medicine, so landing would only put them in a difficult situation. Wearing a protective suit, Coranio led a group of people into Poison Fong's research base. There were a lot of people working inside. Walking into a lab, Coranio saw a finger-sized insect through a transparent partition. Is that the thing that's causing such a ruckus here? Coranio pointed at an insect inside the lab. Yes. A researcher wearing a protective suit said with a crazed look in his eyes, "We've never seen this insect's genes before. We haven't even seen any species that are similar to it. Their genetic composition is a little special." The researchers here were only wearing normal lab coats before, but after 2 researchers had their bodies invaded by insects while they were researching them, causing them to become the experimental subjects of their colleagues, the researchers in the experimental base all wore thick protective suits. Since most of them stayed in the research base, more than half of them were not infected by the parasites. The bird of paradise that came later had not yet spread to this place. Listening to a string of technical jargon that he did not understand at all, Coranio raised a hand and strangled the researcher who was talking to himself. This king is not here to listen to your long-winded nonsense. Just as the researcher's eyes rolled back and his neck was about to snap, Coranio finally let go and put the researcher down. How's the specialized medicine coming along? Cough, 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 cough. The researcher recovered and answered, "It'll take about 5 more hours to complete the preliminary analysis." Coranio let out a low growl. He was obviously very dissatisfied with this answer. What can we do with these insects right now? Not yet. They're very fast. Say no more. Coranio cut him off and said to the people behind him, "If there's no progress in 5 hours, kill them." Yes, my king. The researchers were afraid. This time, Coranio was for real. They had wanted to get more infected people to use as test subjects, but it looked like they had no choice but to give up for now. They had to hurry up. 5 hours was enough for a lot of things to happen. 5 hours later, the number of birds of paradise had grown to a terrifying number. They had also entered the logarithmic growth period that Cylon had originally calculated. When he opened his eyes, Cylon's eyes were cold. He flicked the ear of Hui Mao, who was curled up in his arms and sleeping soundly. "Whis, it's time to get up and hunt." Chapter 121. It hadn't even been 10 hours since Cylon had arrived on this planet, but the situation on this planet had completely changed in less than 10 hours. The Poison Fong members who were usually unwilling to even wear combat suits or anti-radiation jackets were now all wrapped up tightly and wearing the extra thick protective suits that were specially made for the occasion. They had to admit that Poison Fong did have a lot of talents. Under Coranio's coercion, the people in Poison Fong's research base had modified and upgraded the suppressant to better suppress the growth of the parasites inside their bodies. Although the specialized medicine hadn't been developed yet, it had already solved the urgent problem. At the same time, the combat suits could better protect them from the birds of paradise's attacks. However, they were still in a tense state. The slightest tear in their protective suits would turn them into the birds of paradise's targets. However, they couldn't wrap themselves up tightly all day long. Eating, drinking, and defecating were unavoidable, so Poison Fong had set up special isolation rooms in many places. The personnel who entered would be scanned multiple times, and they would only be allowed to enter after confirming that they weren't carrying those dangerous insects. A few hours later, the number of birds of paradise had reached a terrifying number. Although Poison Fong didn't do a precise count, someone had done a rough calculation, and the conclusion they came up with made them feel endless panic. They had tried a series of measures such as burning, freezing, and using drugs, but the results weren't very good. These insects were too fast, and their resistance was also very high. The people in the research base even suspected that these insects had decent intelligence. If that was true, then this war between humans and insects would probably be very difficult. These insects were too good at seizing opportunities. Right now, Carreño hated Silin and a mouse to the core. He was certain that either a mouse or Silin was the cause of all of this. No matter who it was, Carreño would definitely make them regret being born into this world. When Carreño learned that the weapons in the armory had disappeared, his gloomy mood turned into a storm. He raised his hand and killed a couple of people who came to report the situation to vent his anger. The internal conflicts within Poison Fong began to grow. Some people wanted to betray Poison Fong like a mouse, but Carreño ruthlessly suppressed them. This caused the already red planet to turn even redder. Knowing that Silin wasn't in the hall, Carreño issued a kill order. Whoever killed Silin would be the next Skeleton King. The moment he said this, Poison Fong's men became excited and suppressed much of the panic brought about by the insects. They all began searching for traces of Silin. Inside a warehouse, 3 Poison Fong members were chatting with their guns. They had just finished their patrol and finally had the chance to sit down and rest. Those jumping bugs are driving me crazy. This protective suit is so King awkward. I feel like I've suddenly crossed a ton. I feel like an idiot, another person complained. I'd rather wear this. It's much better than being bitten to death by those jumping bugs. As he spoke, 3 cold lights suddenly shot towards the 3 of them, but it didn't cause them any direct harm. The 3 of them immediately became alert. Who is it? One of them raised his gun and looked around warily. It's over. What are you talking about? Hurry up and find him. No, our protective suits are torn. There was no killing intent, no unusual movements. It was just 3 cold lights that appeared out of nowhere. Before the 3 of them could react, they had already cut through their protective suits. The trio stared blankly at the tiny wound on their shoulders, cold sweat dripping down their backs. The birds of paradise who had been spying on them from the shadows grew restless. The 3 screams caused the atmosphere in the originally quiet warehouse to become strangely eerie. Hearing the screams, the people around them hurriedly surrounded them. Whoosh! A shadow flashed past them so fast that it was difficult to capture it. Not to mention that they were wearing thick protective suits and their movements were much slower. It was even more impossible for them to capture the shadow that flashed past them. This person raised his gun and pointed it at the surroundings. After looking around, he didn't find anything out of the ordinary. However, the people who had rushed over with him took a few steps back at the same time when they saw him. Because they were all wearing masks, he couldn't see their expressions clearly. However, this person knew that the others definitely didn't look good. What on earth happened? Before he could finish his sentence, an intense pain came from his back. He knew what this meant. Despair, fear. No wonder everyone retreated. No, I refuse to accept this. Why are you retreating? Why am I the one who got my protective suit cut? Why am I the one who became a sacrifice for those worms? If I'm going to hell, I'm going to drag you down with me. This person pulled the trigger, and the others around him also opened fire. Bang, bang, bang. The sound of gunshots rang out incessantly. The thick protective suits that ordinary bullets couldn't penetrate were riddled with holes under the various laser bullets. The birds of paradise, who took advantage of the situation, seemed to be very excited. Mixed with screams and curses, blood, and smoke, it was like hell. On the other side, at the plaza where Poison Fong used to execute criminals, the people who had been dead for many days were tied to crosses. Right now, at the center of these crosses, Carreño had his men erect special crosses again. They were fire-resistant, super low-temperature resistant, and corrosion-resistant. Unlike in the past, they didn't tie up the criminals this time. Instead, they tied up the native beasts of the planet. As if they knew the danger they were about to face, these beasts struggled and howled with all their might. The metal chains clanked against each other as they struggled. Dressed in protective suit, Carreño sat on a high chair and watched the activity below with his head propped on his hand. These dead people didn't have parasites inside their bodies, and the dead couldn't provide them with good nutrition either. Therefore, they weren't the targets of those jumping worms. That was why Carreño thought of a solution. Although it was a little stupid, it was still a good way to boost the morale of the troops at this stage. The repeated waves of panic had caused Poison Fong's men to become a little nervous. As their leader, Skeleton King naturally had to show his worth as a leader. After the 10 native beasts were tied up, the people on the cross swiftly retreated to the stands. Then, under their expectant gazes, the jumping worms swarmed towards the native beasts tied to the crosses one after another. There were worms of all stages of growth, big and small. Since Poison Fong's men were wearing thick protective suits, they couldn't bite through the protective suits in one go. Instead, they might be caught. The birds of paradise possessed a certain level of intelligence, so they would only attack people with holes in their protective suits. However, it wasn't easy to encounter people with holes in their protective suits for the past few hours. The birds of paradise's reproduction rate was so fast that many worms couldn't obtain enough nutrition. Now that Carreño had released the native beasts, he had undoubtedly given them more food to eat. The native beasts let out tearing wails. Carreño was very satisfied as he watched the worms burrowing into the native beasts' bodies one after another. He was quite impressed by his own foresight. After discovering this scene, he had set up multiple layers of protection around the breeding ground. Originally, it was only to preserve the meat rations, but now it seemed that the meat rations were quite useful. Seeing that the situation was about right, Carreño pressed the button beside him. A transparent barrier suddenly appeared from the ground around the cross field and trapped it inside. Chapter 122. The insects inside the transparent barrier began to grow restless. Some of the insects that had already burrowed into the native beast bodies rushed out in an attempt to break through the barrier. Some of the Poison Fong members saw it clearly. Perhaps it was because the insects happened to be in an area where the bones were densely packed. They bit through the native beast bones. They opened their mouths wide and let out sharp cries that could be heard even through the transparent barrier. The white bones that had been bitten through the uprooted flesh were very eye-catching. The Poison Fong members who saw this scene unconsciously shuddered. No wonder those who had been bitten had screamed so miserably, and no wonder those who had committed suicide without hesitation the moment they were bitten. Enduring this kind of pain was indeed worse than death. Carreño pressed another button, and several jets appeared inside the transparent barrier. Crimson tongues of flame spat out of the jets, and the transparent barrier was instantly filled with flames. Someone beside him moved closer to Carreño and reported the situation over at the warehouse. Carreño waved his hand and motioned for them to leave it be for now. At the same time, he turned on the communicator and said something. Then, he returned to his previous posture and looked down at the situation below from above. The transparent barrier might have isolated the inside from the outside, but in reality, there were ventilation holes in all four directions. These ventilation holes only allowed air to flow, but not the insects inside to escape. Smelling the faint burnt smell in the air and listening to the sharp cries of the insects inside, the Poison Fong members laughed arrogantly. It was also the most carefree laughter they had heard in the past few hours. However, they did not know that this would be the last time they would laugh like this in their lives. At the same time, Silin and Hui Mao were hiding somewhere close to Poison Fong's research base. In order to cut off Poison Fong's hope, they had to destroy this research base. Scylla knew what kind of place Poison Fong's research base was. It reminded Scylla of the underground laboratory in the slum town. It was so cold and merciless, and filled with twisted and crazy people. Hui Mao was crouching on the ground like a cat with his ears pressed down. His eyes were staring blankly at the research base not far away from him. The defense measures of the base were very good. It only needed to listen to know that it would not be easy to break in. Otherwise, the defense system outside would directly blast them into pieces. Just as he was about to ask Scylla what he should do, he turned around and saw Scylla take out something the size of a lunchbox. Hui Mao was furious. "Scylla, you glutton. Now is not the time to eat a boxed meal." Scylla, in this world, the one who was least qualified to say such words was this stupid cat. Still eating boxed lunches? Who would be so stupid as to squat in such a place and eat a boxed lunch? Only a gluttonous cat, like you would think of that. Scylla pinched Hui Mao's ear. "Good boy, go dig a hole. Drop this thing right under the base and retreat quickly. Pay attention to concealment and shielding. You understand? There's no need to ask questions about such simple things." Hui Mao picked up the small box with its mouth and dug its front limbs like a drill bit. After predicting the possible underground scanning range, Hui Mao dug to the depth Scylla mentioned and moved towards the base. After confirming the location, it put the small box down and quickly returned along the original path. Before the gray cat could even boast about its achievement, Scylla had already grabbed it and started running madly. Before he ran, he didn't forget to throw a few quail eggs. After retreating to a safe area, Scylla put Hui Mao down. "Meow, are you running for your life?" Their scanning system has just switched to life signal scanning. Any life signal outside the base will be mercilessly killed by the defense system. It should be the skeleton boss's order. Usually, because there would be guards and patrols around the base, life signal scanning wouldn't be activated. But just now it was activated. Good alertness, but we retreated quickly. They probably didn't notice, right? Hui Mao looked towards the base. The few quail eggs that Scylla had tossed down earlier had been completely annihilated by the defense system. The bugs that were hiding in the dark had also been killed. No, we retreated quickly. If we were a second slower, we wouldn't have survived. That's good. But what is that box? Hui Mao asked. It's specially prepared for this kind of laboratory. Hui Mao flicked its ears and continued to stare at the situation. It wanted to see what the specially prepared thing Scylla mentioned was. 5 seconds later, the alarm of the entire base rang. Life signal scanning is off. Scylla threw a few quail eggs in that direction. From the moment he remotely controlled the switch on the box, the base's scanning system had discovered this thing underground. However, Scylla had added some interference devices on the outer shell of the box, so that the scanning system's analysis of the level of danger would take a lot longer. By the time the analysis was completed, there wouldn't be many chances left for the people in the experimental base to escape. Hearing Scylla's words, Hui Mao was about to ask why when he saw the base's gate open. A group of people rushed out, and the entire base began to sink. The screams did not stop, each louder than the one before. There were all kinds of screams of unwillingness, despair, sorrow, and fear. Those who escaped had to face the birds of paradise that had broken out of their shells. There was no way out at the back. Hui Mao, who was at a loss, suddenly froze. Its fur stood on end. It saw that the base was turning into sand from the inside out. The sandstorm and the birds of paradise were undoubtedly a devastating blow. Although the people wearing protective suits were no longer afraid of the birds of paradise, the thick protective suits affected their movements, causing them to be unable to keep up with the speed of the birds of paradise. They were pulled into the whirlpool and turned into sand. The circular area with a diameter of 500 meters had turned into sand, mixed with the wind and dust of the scarlet sand. Soon, this area would become a part of the scarlet sand region. There would no longer be a base, only a piece of sand. Scylla was a little lost in thought as he looked at the sand. It was as if he had returned to that rainy night when he entered the underground laboratory and was tied to the experiment table. Those people had imposed their madness on the innocent, and then they had achieved glory and left their names in journals with high contribution points. However, did they ever think about those innocent people who were forced to die on the experiment table and those restless souls? Celine had no right to criticize those crazier researchers. To a certain extent, Celine himself was not much better. Who was good and who was evil? Who was right and who was wrong? Celine did not want to think so much. It was enough to live and live with those who were good to him. Taking a deep breath and smelling the smell of sand mixed with blood, Celine put aside other complicated thoughts and turned to look at Huimao, who was still stiff and angry, and poked its back with a finger in amusement. Meow! Huimao arched its back and jumped up high. Well, it was scared silly again. Stupid. Coming back to its senses, Huimao angrily jumped on Celine's shoulder and stretched out its forelimbs to slap Celine's face. Okay, my fault. I shouldn't have suddenly attacked you when you were in a daze. I wasn't in a daze, I was just thinking. I was thinking. Yes, thinking. After pacifying Huimao, the man and the cat moved on to the next step. Chapter 123. At the cross field, Carreño stared at the transparent cover with his brows knitted tighter and tighter. The first time they had bound the native beasts and trapped the insects inside the cover, the high-temperature fire had been very effective. It had indeed boosted their low morale greatly, but the second wave had failed. It was obvious that many of the insects would only wander around the perimeter of the cover instead of gathering together. To be more precise, they would only wander around the perimeter of the transparent cover and not step into the area where they were trapped. These insects' intelligence was pretty high, and it annoyed Carreño a lot. Their opponents had always been humans and viruses, and they had never faced such creatures before. When it came to humans, they slaughtered wantonly. When it came to viruses, most Poison Fong members had developed a resistance to them after many experiences. However, Carreño was powerless against these insects. He could only hope that the research base could come up with a countermeasure as soon as possible. Since the beginning, Carreño had a bad feeling. One could even say that it was an ominous feeling. How many years had it been since he fought his way out of Sector V single-handedly until he founded Poison Fong? He had never felt this way before. Suddenly, the communicator in Carreño's hand rang. After he picked up the notification, a terrified, trembling voice came from the other side. King, the base has been destroyed. The research base has been destroyed. Carreño felt as if a basin of ice had been poured down from the top of his head. It was bone-chilling cold. Inhaling deeply, Carreño tried to find the right syllables. Didn't I tell you to activate the defense system to its highest level and use the life signature detector to scan the outside? Carreño was almost roaring at the end of his speech. The originally noisy cross field instantly fell into a dead silence. Even the native beasts tied to the crosses seemed to be scared out of their wits and kept quiet out of fear. The entire cross field was suddenly enveloped by Carreño's anger and killing intent. Bang! Listening to the report from the communicator, Carreño could no longer control himself and crushed the communicator. His two pairs of fangs were almost parallel to the ground. Everyone in Poison Fong knew that this was Skeleton King Carreño's moment of anger. No one dared to breathe loudly. Carreño sat on the chair, his eyes clouded over. Let's continue. After saying that, Carreño stood up and left, leaving the group of Poison Fong members looking at each other in dismay. After Carreño left the cross field, he went to an isolation room, took out his communicator, and connected the signal. Are the researchers still around? Carreño mentioned a few names. They were the main people in charge of the research on the parasites and the bird of paradise. However, the report from the other side swept away Carreño's wishful thinking. Out of the 5 researchers who were in charge of researching the 2 types of insects, only one was lucky enough to survive. However, it was only survival, and it was unknown how long he could last. This was because the last remaining researcher was also in a state of severe injuries. A bird of paradise had bitten through his lungs, and at the same time, his liver and kidneys were also bitten. The other researchers who had escaped tried their best to rescue him and force the bird of paradise out of his body. However, Everyone knew that without the relevant equipment and the relevant materials from the experimental base, it would be very difficult for this person to survive. The research lab was located at the innermost part of the base, and it was the lab with the best security. At the same time, it was also the first place to suffer from desertification. It was already a miracle that they were able to escape, but there was no helping it. There was still a hungry bird of paradise that had just hatched and was waiting for them outside the base. All of the information and research results, even if they weren't the final results, had reached a certain level of research. It was only a matter of time before the analysis was complete. Everything had turned to sand. Scylla wanted to see them being pushed step by step towards the cliff of despair, and be punished in panic and despair. By now, Carreño was very certain that everything was planned by Scylla. That seemingly simple and honest young man was actually a devil, and he had brought disaster upon them. Since he couldn't catch Scylla, Carreño really wanted to act against a mouse and Joaquin. But there was no other way. With a Mao's abilities, he couldn't touch a mouse at all without the relevant weapons and equipment. It would only be a waste of combat power. Carreño was very regretful. Poison Fong had been too reliant on a mouse for the past few years. He didn't feel it normally, but after he truly separated a mouse, he realized that a mouse hand was everywhere. After some thought, Carreño issued the highest order for Poison Fong to hunt down Scylla at all costs, disregarding all other matters of the moment. Since Scylla was able to bring these insects here and avoid their invasion at the same time, it meant that Scylla had a way to deal with these insects. He couldn't count on the experimenters anymore, so Carreño placed his final hope on Scylla. At the same time, he let every Poison Fong member know that Scylla had a way to avoid the insects. The little Poison Fong members searched even harder. At this time, Scylla, the person whom Carreño hated to the bone, brought Huimao to a deserted airport. Carreño had already abandoned this airport, and there were a few space planes and fighter jets parked there. Both the space planes and fighter jets have a self-destruct program, and there's also a remote control bomb. The main controller should be in Carreño's hands. If we take off in a space plane or fighter jet, it will definitely explode like fireworks in less than 2 seconds. This was also a trap Carreño had set up after Akai and the others had left in the space plane. Controlling the space planes and fighter jets would prevent Scylla and the others from escaping even if he couldn't catch them. Scylla's words had undoubtedly caused Huimao, who was planning to fly a space plane for fun, to retreat far away. Right now, Huimao was afraid of a lot of human weapons. The more it came into contact with them, the more it knew that there were enough things in human weapons that could turn an extremely rare miracle creature like it into dust. After a round of inspection, Scylla walked onto a space plane. Everyone who could escape had done so, and those who couldn't had become the bird of paradise's delicious meal. A person who was half lying at the entrance of the passage, unable to avoid the bird of paradise's poisonous fangs in time, had already been bitten beyond recognition. When Scylla walked to his side, the bird of paradise's eggs had just hatched in his body. The birds of paradise that had crawled out were extremely excited to see a living human in front of them. However, they stopped just as they were about to move. The human in front of them had a special aura that made them shrink back. At the same time, it was as familiar as their mothers. No matter which one it was, it dispelled their desire to attack. As for Huimao, the birds of paradise didn't dare to attack him at all. This abnormal life form was too dangerous. The baby birds of paradise obediently crawled out and went to find other life forms. "All right, let's go," Scylla said to Huimao. "What did you do?" "Nothing much. I just took the energy blocks inside." Realization dawned on Huimao. "I see. Is there anything valuable left? When we leave this place, we can sell them for a good price to pay off our debts." Scylla smiled and patted the cat's head. "No, let's go. Let's go to the next space plane." "Hee, all right. It's mine if I get it first. Let's go find our own. Be careful, don't touch the other power devices. If you accidentally start the space plane, I'll have to erect another cross here." I know. I don't need you to tell me about machinery." Huimao flicked his ears and went to look for the energy blocks inside other space planes and fighters. Poor Carreño. He had originally set up a trap, but he didn't expect that Scylla and Huimao would squeeze out the last bit of value from him. Scylla looked at the sky. According to the original plan, the hunt was about to begin. He tore off the skull emblem on the chest of the man who had been bitten by the birds of paradise and walked out of the space plane. Chapter 124. After the Skeleton King issued Coranio's highest kill order, the Poison Fong members began to move one after another. Coupled with Coranio's declaration that Sillin had a way to deal with those insects, the Poison Fong members searched tirelessly like they had seen their last hope. However, they couldn't even find Sillin's shadow. It was as if he had vanished without a trace. But there was one thing that proved that Sillin was still active in this area. King, their emblems have all been taken away. A person reported to Coranio. The emblems on the chests of the dead Poison Fong members in every area had been taken away. Coranio did not say a word. He knew that this was Sillin's act of revenge. He had taken away the emblems made from the bones of every Poison Fong member and used them as a memorial to the Vanguard Division 6 members who had died in the previous battle. On the other side, a search party consisting of a dozen or so people had their protective suits cut open one after another, but they still couldn't see the person who did it. They had accidentally hurt a few of their companions when they used their life signal detection, but they did not regret it. At the very least, it gave them peace of mind. Sillin did not take action himself. Instead, he set up some traps and moved around outside of their detection range. While the dozen or so people were searching, one of them touched something, and some throwing knives suddenly shot out of the ground. These throwing knives were made of special metal, and even if they couldn't completely cut open the protective suit in one go, they could still make a shallow cut. This was enough to make these Poison Fong members tremble in fear. Sillin's goal wasn't to cut open their protective suits in one go, but to increase their mental pressure. Throwing knives, guns outside of their detection range, burning smoke grenades, and all kinds of other mischievous tricks made these Poison Fong members want to commit suicide. There was a limit to how tense a person could be. Once this limit was exceeded, they would either become a lunatic or mentally ill. If the protective suit could survive the first time, what about the second, third, or even seventh time? Poison Fong knew that there would always be a cut, but what they didn't know was when it would happen. These people walked to a corner with tense nerves, and with a click they stepped on something. Then, a large area of flames suddenly appeared on the ground. The ground was originally covered with a layer of medicine, so it was not a threat. There were also some small balls on the ground that were very similar to the color of the ground. These small balls contained another kind of chemical. When a small ball was stepped on, the chemical inside would be released. When the chemical came into contact with the chemical on the ground, it would cause a violent burning reaction when it came into contact with oxygen. Then, the poison fangs would dodge in panic, and as they dodged, they would step on even more of the little balls. In the end, it would cause a large area of high-temperature flames to surround them. The flames surrounded them, burning their protective suits. Although the suits could withstand the high temperature for a while, they couldn't stay for long. They quickly ran away, but the road was covered with chemicals. Although the original road did not have those balls, the substances inside the balls were still on the soles of their feet. As they ran, they would carry the substances inside the balls to other places that were covered with chemicals. In other words, wherever they ran on this road that was covered with chemicals, there would be a fire. Finally, he was out of the range of the flames, but a blood-curdling scream rang out. Following that was a second person, then a third. It turned out that those people's protective suits already had shallow cuts. The protective suits with shallow cuts could no longer withstand the high temperature of the flames, and a hole was torn open. The birds of paradise took the opportunity to burrow in. After torturing the poison fangs to the brink of insanity, they were finally attacked by the birds of paradise. After that, only 2 lucky fellows were left with their protective suits that had not been torn open. However, before they could catch their breath, a figure flashed by, and 2 holes were slashed on their backs. After being burned by the flames, the detector also malfunctioned, so it failed to send out an alarm in time. The last 2 people in this group had also fallen. 5 minutes later, Sillin slowly walked out of the building. He cut open the protective suits on the chests of the poison fangs that had been bitten beyond recognition and took away the emblem. Coranio listened to one report after another that made his veins pop. He was so angry that he smashed his chair a few times. Through the transparent cover of the mask, two pairs of fangs could be seen parallel to the ground. Bring this king's pets over. Take care to protect them. Yes. Upon receiving the skeleton king's order, the few people beside him ran out to carry it out as though they were fleeing. Facing the skeleton king was indeed stressful. Inside the hall, El Mouse and Joaquin were leaning against a box of energy ores as they chatted and probed each other. However, both of them were at the level of foxes, so it was rare for them to get anything useful out of each other. Just then, someone came in and looked at the two people inside the four-layered energy barrier. However, he did not say a word and moved a few chairs away from the hall. What are they doing? Joaquin asked. I'm guessing that Carreño is about to release his little pets. TSK. Looks like Carreño's brain isn't so stupid that it's negative. He finally thought of this method. El Mouse said while stroking his chin, his eyes dark and unreadable. Joaquin directly filtered out the latter part of El Mouse's words and asked in puzzlement, little pets. That's right. Just like how a dog can track its target based on smell, Carreño's little pets have an extraordinary sense of smell. Joaquin began to worry. Many people said that an animal's sense of smell was more sensitive than a detector, not to mention a species that had a considerable advantage in smell. Scylla had previously sat on a chair in the hall and left behind a scent. Carreño was going to track Scylla based on the scent that Scylla had left on the chair. He did not know what that kid Scylla would do. As he thought about it, Joaquin suddenly thought of something. His eyebrows relaxed, and there was even a hint of a smile in his eyes. El Mouse was undoubtedly an observant person. He caught the smile in Joaquin's eyes. Vice Captain Joaquin, looks like you have a lot of confidence in Scylla. Tell me what you think of, so I don't have to worry too much. Joaquin did not speak and directly ignored El Mouse. Carreño's little pets were not small. They were more than a meter tall and 2 meters long. They were also a native four-legged mammal species of this planet. They had a keen sense of smell and a good sense of danger. After putting on the emergency protective suits specially made for these pets, each search party led 2 of them out. With the help of these little pets, Poison Fong's search became much more convenient. Scylla had moved around in many places, so it was impossible to say that he did not leave any traces behind. Each search party led Carreño's pets and followed the scent everywhere. In the end, after going around in circles, every search party's target was the same, the cross field. Chapter 125. Although they had found a way to hunt down and kill Scylla, panic still shrouded Poison Fong. Discounting those who wandered outside of Sector Z, Poison Fong originally numbered almost 100,000 people on this planet. But now, Carreño suddenly discovered that there were less than 50,000 of them left before he knew it. No one had expected that a mere Scylla, a bastard who was completely unknown in the galaxy, would be able to kill more than 50,000 people on this planet. Of course, these 50,000 people were basically buried in the stomachs of the worms. Other than the birds of paradise, the original little parasites had slowly developed a resistance to the primary inhibitor after the research base had been decertified. Once they had developed a resistance, then the Poison Fong people who were parasitized by these little parasites would not be able to hold on for long. Without the birds of paradise, the parasitized people were like living nutrient providers who were slowly sucked dry by the little parasites. While they were chasing after Scylla, a lot of Poison Fong members collapsed while they were running, and they never got up again after they fell. Inside their bodies, a large number of little parasites were dividing and multiplying every minute. The parasites that had developed resistance to the parasites were like starving refugees who had suddenly seen a table full of delicious food. Therefore, to the Poison Fong people, it only took a few minutes to go from weakness to death. But during these few minutes, they could clearly feel the process of their own weakness and the loss of their life. It was as if a devil's hand was pulling their souls slowly towards hell. There was no struggle, only despair. The research base. This was no doubt a sharp knife to Carreño's heart. It was also the biggest slap to the face Carreño had endured in all these years. In reality, the destruction of Poison Fong's research base contained many factors. The Scarlet Sand region's geographical environment accelerated the rate of desertification, and the research base was not discovered in time. By the time the desertification reached the research base, it was already too late to stop it. Moreover, no one would have thought that a cyborg who could dig holes and block scanning signals would appear in this place. That was why Carranio still didn't know why something like this had happened all of a sudden. However, since it had already happened, it was already too late to investigate the cause. Right now, Carranio had placed all of his energy on hunting down Cylon. Night slowly descended around the cross field. To Poison Fong, night was once their favorite time. They loved to slaughter under the cover of night and listen to their prey's terrified and despairing cries. However, the current situation was different. Cylon was like a silent catcher hiding in the shadows, pushing them to the brink of collapse step by step. What would happen if night fell? The Poison Fangs didn't dare to imagine. The night belongs to the devil. The temperature difference between day and night on the planet was huge. Although the thick protective suits could keep them warm, they always felt abnormally cold. The kind of cold that numbed their scalp, and every pore on their body exuded cold air, stimulated their nerves, and tightened them again and again. The pets had followed the scent to the cross field, but they could only wander around the edge of the cross field. They could not confirm Cylon's general location or pinpoint his exact location. This was undoubtedly another blow to Poison Fong. 50,000 people had silently gathered at the edge of the cross field and formed a circle to surround it. But no matter how hard they searched, they couldn't find Cylon's figure no matter how hard they searched and turned the cross field upside down. They searched every inch of the cross field like madmen, but the result was like a cold joke mocking their incompetence. Another person fell. Someone fell at every moment. This cross field was like a devil's domain that absorbed the souls of these people at every moment. The night, the blood, the crosses, and the people fell one after another. The sinners who had been dead for many days, and the native beasts who had been gnawed by the birds of paradise to the point where only a few incomplete bones were left, laughed at the people surrounding them amidst the whistling wind. It was as if they were waiting for these people to accompany them. An hour later, 2 out of 5 people were gone, and only 30,000 were left. 20,000 people had fallen just like that. There were no loud gunshots, no bloody slaughter. They had simply fallen. They had never experienced such a feeling of helplessness and powerlessness before. For the first time, their hands that held their guns trembled. They had killed again and again, walked through the bloody battlefield, and watched their prey struggle to their deaths pointlessly under their blades and muzzles. They thought that they could face the Azura hell in peace, but in the end, they discovered that true hell did not require terrible screams or gunfire. In this quiet battlefield, they could watch as Azrael's hand grabbed their throats and took their souls away. Half an hour later, there were only 10,000 people left. The pace of death grew even faster. The remaining people were undoubtedly the elites of Poison Fong. Their gene rank allowed them to hold out longer, but they could only hold on. Without the suppressant, they had only slowed down their march to hell. So what if they had rank A genes? They had no choice but to admit defeat in front of these minuscule life forms. The current Poison Fong was no longer under Carranio's control. Poison Fong had always been an uncontrollable group to begin with. Poison Fong was neither an army nor a hunter regiment. They were just people who had gathered together to satisfy the pleasure of reaping lives. Under Cylon's constant pressure, their taut nerves finally reached a tipping point: madness. The remaining people had gone mad. Since they were going to die sooner or later, they might as well enjoy this final moment of madness. The people in the aircraft in the air began to fire at the ground. The flames illuminated the flesh and blood that were blown away by the shells and the birds of paradise that were leaping among them. The killing stimulated their excitement, and they laughed even more crazily. Those who had lost their rationality raised the guns in their hands and either shot at others or themselves. Perhaps many of them had never thought that they would be the ones to reap their lives in the end. Carranio sat quietly at a high place and watched the chaotic battle between the aircrafts and aircrafts below. He was so quiet that he looked like an outsider. Around him lay people who had been torn to shreds. The current Carreño was not wearing a protective suit, but no birds of paradise could approach him. The current Carreño was the real Carreño, the skeleton king that not even the birds of paradise dared to approach. Poison Fong knew that Sillin could make those insects avoid him, but they didn't know that their king could do the same. Carreño knew that Sillin was also watching the scene quietly from a certain place. Who was more despicable? Who was more cruel? Those who knew Poison Fong said that they were a bunch of lunatics, but Carreño felt that Sillin was even colder, crazier, and more like a devil than Poison Fong. Chapter 126. The dark night, the blood, the slaughter, and the coldness that flowed through the pores of the thick protective suits stimulated the madness in Poison Fong's hearts. Kill, 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 until they could no longer move a muscle. The cross erected at the center of the square bore witness to the madness of Poison Fong. After the commotion, the ruined cross field was filled with blood, flesh, flying sand, stone fragments, metal wreckage, and fire. In less than 15 minutes, all that was left of the 10,000 or so people was a single space plane and 2 fighter jets engaged in a final battle. Sillin and Hui Mao watched everything quietly. They hadn't stayed around the cross field before this. Using a beast's sense of smell to create traps was something Sillin often did. That was why Sillin had left behind a special scent that could be retained for a longer period of time from the moment he stepped on a Poison Fong's transport to the Great Hall and all the way until he set up the trap at the cross field. It was all for the sake of gathering the group of people at the cross field. Now that all the scanners in the area had been destroyed and Carreño's pets had been killed a long time ago, Sillin and Hui Mao approached the cross field and watched the final madness of Poison Fong in the sky. Sillin, leave the last 3 to me. Hui Mao had been holding back for a long time. Originally, Hui Mao was going to show off his might when Sillin forbade him from attacking. He was incredibly disappointed now. No, it's already come to this. You should just stay put and see if there are any survivors on the ground. Let's finish them off and fish out their emblems. Sillin had his own concerns. He didn't want Hui Mao to expose too much of himself. A minute later, the 2 fighter jets were destroyed and the space plane exploded in midair. Everything returned to normal. After a moment of silence, Carreño's voice rang. He, Vanguard Division 6 Sillin, you surprised this king. Although he was laughing, there was an indescribable coldness in his voice. Skeleton King Carreño slowly walked out of the half-collapsed building like he was taking a stroll. The collapsed buildings didn't seem to affect the Skeleton King at all. In the past, Carreño would have never believed that 50,000 people were annihilated in 2 hours or so, and Sillin hadn't even done anything himself. Moreover, these people had not died cleanly. It could be said that these 50,000 people had been forced to their death step by step. They had experienced terror, despair, helplessness, and the process of their lives slipping away. From the moment Sillin stepped into the cross field, Carreño had locked his gaze on his Sillin. His night vision was pretty good. He stared closely at Sillin, afraid that he would escape in the next moment. However, Sillin did not plan to escape. It was time to end this matter. To Carreño, the death of 100,000 people stationed on the planet really wasn't that big of a blow. Even if these 100,000 people were gone, he could just take a stroll around Sector V and gather new batches of Poison Fong. Moreover, there were plenty of desperados in the galaxy, and 100,000 people was just a number. Therefore, to Carreño, the most important thing was not the death of these 100,000 people, but Sillin himself. Carreño was going to tear this devil-like brat into 1,000 pieces, burn his bones, and scatter his ashes. Swoosh! Carreño charged at Sillin like lightning. Under the scattered firelight, Sillin could see his body clearly. His body had doubled in size, and there were curved fangs growing out his torso. There was also a huge black shadow behind Carreño. That was his tail, a barbed tail. When he was charging, the tail swung to increase his momentum and speed. Sillin knew that Carreño wasn't a normal human, but he didn't think that Carreño's true form would look like this. Moreover, the information Shotten had shown Sillin didn't contain Carreño's true situation either. It had to be said that Carreño had hidden himself very well. It was likely that even a mouse, who had been hiding in Poison Fong for so many years, didn't know Carreño's true appearance. As Carreño got closer, a thick, murderous aura hit him in the face. No wonder those birds of paradise didn't dare approach him. It was likely that those little parasites didn't affect Carreño much. At most, they would be a little bit at the time, but they would be forced to death by Carreño later on. Carreño's mask and thick protective clothing were all for show. In reality, Carreño didn't need them at all. This was suppression, true suppression. It was a power that completely surpassed a normal human's ability in genetic state. Perhaps Carreño didn't belong to a single genus. He might be an unconventional person who possessed the bloodline of several genera and absorbed the advantages of each species to become the skeleton king he was today. Sillin thought that his physical constitution was pretty good, especially when he was in a solidified state. However, it was only after he clashed with Carreño that he realized just how strong this skeleton king was. He blocked both Carreño's hand and Carreño's sweeping tail at the same time. His arm felt numb for a moment. What kind of physique was this? He bent his body and backed away, avoiding the 2 rows of sharp teeth on Carreño's torso. To be more precise, they could be considered the specialized bones on Carreño's torso. He looked huge, but his movements were nimble and his attack speed was very fast. Coupled with his physical advantage of having 2 hands, 2 legs, a tail, and the 2 rows of specialized bones on his torso, Sillin really couldn't do anything to him for now. Even the current Sillin wouldn't be able to get the upper hand in a head-on clash. Carreño was rich in combat experience, and he knew the weaknesses of humans. His attacks were swift and fierce, and every one of his attacks carried the determination to kill. As the king of Poison Fong, Carreño's presence was overwhelming. A normal person wouldn't have the courage to resist just standing in front of Carreño, much less fight him. Sillin retreated step by step while blocking Carreño's attacks. Carreño was so strong that Sillin had no choice but to retreat every time he blocked an attack to neutralize the impact. At the same time, he had to deal with the rain of fists, claws, and annoying tail. Sillin parried the claws with long, sharp nails and dodged to the side. Then, he leapt into the air and kicked Carreño's sweeping tail. Using the force of the tail, he jumped backwards. While he was in the air, 2 guns appeared in Sillin's hands. Bang, bang, bang. The bullets flew at Carreño from the front and 2 sides. Carreño, who was chasing after him, did not dodge. His tail flattened and covered Carreño's body like a cloak. When the bullets collided with his tail, the sound of metal clanging could be heard. The bullets that hit Carreño's tail would at most leave a mark or break the surface layer of skin. It would recover in no time. Sillin narrowed his eyes. When he landed on the ground, he exerted strength in his legs and continued to retreat. This time, it wasn't bullets but flying knives. They weren't much slower than bullets, and they attacked from 3 directions at the same time. Carreño used the same method and widened his flattened tail to cover his body. The flying knives made cracking sounds when they hit his tail. However, the cracking sound was followed by the sound of corrosion. Chapter 127. Sillin would never fight head-on like an idiot and ask for abuse when he knew he was weaker than his opponent. The flying dagger was specially made by Sillin before he arrived. The dagger was not thin, and the brittle outer shell was wrapped in a strong corrosive liquid. In order to seal the corrosive liquid inside the dagger, Sillin even used some expensive inert materials to prevent the corrosive liquid from corroding the outer shell of the dagger. In fact, Sillin's original idea was to use the outer shell of the dagger to scratch the surface of the opponent's body, and then let the corrosive liquid seep into the opponent's wound to inflict the greatest amount of damage. However, even if the dagger could not scratch the opponent's skin, the corrosive liquid that splashed out from the broken dagger would still be useful. Now, it was indeed the case. The liquid splashed on Carreño's flattened tail, and the pain from the corrosion made Carreño very angry. This kid is playing tricks again. Carreño let out a long roar, as though he was venting all the anger in his chest. The sound waves shattered the remnants of the crosses that had been destroyed to the point where only a part of them remained. Huimao, who was squatting on a cross that only had a third of its original shape left, jumped down and flicked his ears. For him, this level of sound wave was not enough to hurt him, but he had to find a better place to watch the fight. Carreño's roar traveled far. Even El Mouse and Joaquin inside the energy barrier of the hall heard it. Joaquin was surprised. It should be the Skeleton King's roar, said El Mouse. However, he could also hear the anger in the voice. To be able to force the Skeleton King to this extent, Sillin was indeed very surprising. After all, according to El Mouse's understanding, the Skeleton King, Carreño, would not let out such a roar even if all his subordinates were killed. Carreño was really angry, extremely angry. After so many years, apart from being injured by that person, until now, Carreño had never been so sullen. A common human, a young brat. Not only had he killed his 100,000 subordinates, he had even injured him. Carreño threw caution to the wind. At most, he would just lose one of his tails. It would grow back after a few years. All he had to bear was a moment of pain. What he needed to do now was to crush this cunning brat. As long as he didn't clash head-on, Sillin was able to dodge. In this crossfield, one was retreating while the other was pursuing. Sillin was still retreating and throwing his flying daggers. A layer of Carreño's tail had already been corroded. Carreño was already numb to the pain in his tail. He did not believe that Sillin could continue retreating like this. Sillin was not in a hurry. Carreño was currently in a state of rage. This was a good sign, because in a state of rage, Carreño did not have much brain power to think about other things. When Sillin was very young, he had heard a conversation like this. Do you know why the hunter is superior to the prey? The hunter is stronger than the prey. Only the strong are the hunters, while the weak are the prey. No, because the hunter will set traps. To the fish, the angler was the hunter. They would cast the bait and quietly wait for the fish to take the bait. The people who lived in the forest would set traps to catch large and ferocious beasts. Perhaps when they were excited, they would watch the trapped beast fight. They had long been used to using the smallest amount of effort to catch their prey. Sillin and Carreño both saw the other as prey. But in the end, who would be crowned as the prey? When Carreño realized that something was wrong, it was already too late. The first thing that had happened was his tail. Then, the numbness quickly spread to the rest of his body. Only now did Carreño realize that the cunning kid was playing tricks again. The highly corrosive liquid had corroded the surface layer of Carreño's tail, allowing the toxins behind it to play a better role. The same throwing knife, the same proportion, but the completely different inside. Not to mention Carreño. Even El Mouse might not have thought of this. If the proportion was different, El Mouse might have become suspicious and guessed that there was a difference in the throwing knife. But when Sillin made these, he had completely taken this situation into consideration. The highly corrosive liquid and the concentrated neurotoxin. When Sillin made these two kinds of liquids, he had deliberately taken their proportion into account. However, even if they were not of the same proportion with the current Carreño, he was afraid that he would not notice it. At the same time, his selective ignorance of the pain in his tail had caused Carreño to notice the first poisonous throwing knife. By the time he did notice it, too much of the toxin had already seeped into his tail, and it had spread to the point where he could no longer save it. El Mouse's evaluation of Carreño after hiding in Poison Fong for so many years was that Carreño was ruthless, strong, smart, but not smart enough and not cautious enough. His past achievements had caused the Skeleton King to overlook too many potential threats. He had always thought that he was standing at the top, and that he could look down on the ants below him. But in reality, he had been pulled down into the abyss before he could truly understand how lonely it was to be at the top. Sillin had collected the neurotoxin in the vines that had once poisoned Carrie. On the Green Planet, Sillin had also collected other neurotoxins from plants and animals. The current one was something Sillin had specially prepared for Carreño. Inside Engi's workshop, Sillin had bred 2 types of insects, mixed them with a highly corrosive liquid, and synthesized this neurotoxin that even a rank 8 genotype could not withstand. Carreño could only feel that everything around him was moving further and further away. His hearing, touch, smell, and taste seemed to be deteriorating, and every joint was rusting like scrap metal. Moreover, the rust was getting worse and worse, and his movements were becoming slower and slower. Every muscle was spasming, and his breathing was rapid but irregular. For some reason, Carreño felt that no matter how much he breathed, the oxygen he breathed in was not enough to satisfy his needs. His mind was becoming more and more muddled, and the sporadic sparks seemed to burn his eyes. He could not help but look into the darkness. Not far away, Huimao was squatting on top of the pile of rubble and watching the battle with wide eyes. At this moment, he tilted his head and looked at the man who was walking in an S shape just a moment ago. His nimble and ever-changing tail was dragging weakly on the ground, and Carreño looked like a drunkard as he staggered through the ruins. Sillen stood 100 meters away from Carreño and watched as Carreño moved towards him step by step. However, the effects of the neurotoxin had severely affected Carreño's senses and thoughts. He slowly deviated from his path and finally collapsed on the spot where he once punished sinners and watched slaughter. In the past, it was Carreño, Poison Fong's skeleton king, who sat on a high place and watched the ant-like beings on the ground suffer bloody battles and torture. But now the roles had changed. It was as if Carreño could see him lying under a giant cross, and the devil-like young man standing at the top of the cross, watching indifferently as he struggled in silence. His throat could no longer produce any precise syllables, and all that came out were indiscernible grunts. In truth, he only wanted to say one word, devil. Sillen still stood at a distance and watched expressionlessly. There was no coldness, no mockery, no joy or relief after revenge in his eyes. His eyes were as calm as ever. A while later, Sillen took out a small marble-like object and flicked it at Carreño, who was lying in the ruins. The marble hit Carreño's body and scattered around Carreño. The wind blew past. The surviving birds of paradise around the ruins smelled the scent in the air and swarmed towards Carreño. Sillen closed his eyes and sensed the remaining commotion above the ruins. It's time to end this. Chapter 128. When the first ray of light shone upon the ruins, the dust in the air had already settled down. The only things floating above the ruins were the lingering smell of gunfire and flesh and blood. Inside the great hall, the 4 energy shields gradually faded and dissipated. It was time, according to Sillen, they could walk out of this place without needing to change the energy shields when they dissipated. Moreover, at some point in time, not a single Poison Fong member was left around the Great Hall. Thinking was one thing, but El Mouse and Huaqin could not take the first step. Both of them were veterans. After the energy shields had dissipated, the lingering aura in the air became even more obvious. It was as if it was telling them the faint experience of fear and despair hidden in the darkness. El Mouse and Huaqin looked around warily. El Mouse was ready to throw out more energy shields at any moment. 1 minute, 2 minutes. 5 minutes later, Huaqin inhaled deeply and took the first step. Since Huaqin had taken the first step, El Mouse followed suit. The duo moved their feet step by step. All of the surveillance equipment had been destroyed, and El Mouse could not obtain any images from them. There were a few Poison Fong members who had been dead for a long time lying around the Great Hall, but there were no more than 10 of them. If they were to rely on their hearing alone, they could tell that there was no one around them. When El Mouse activated the scanner, it also showed that there were no living people nearby. El Mouse knew very well how many Poison Fong members were stationed on this planet. That was why he dared not believe the situation in front of him. After all, the area around the Great Hall was a core area, wasn't it? Forget 30 or 50,000, there should be at least 10,000 people, right? But in reality, there was not a single living person on the scanner. At most, a few bugs would occasionally jump past them. El Mouse and Huaqin had an indescribable fear towards bugs. Perhaps it was because Sillen had shocked them too much earlier, but they instinctively wanted to run when they saw the bugs jump past them. However, the bugs seemed to be uninterested in them, so they felt a lot more at ease. However, this peace of mind didn't last for long. The two of them saw a hole suddenly burst open in the chest of a dead man. The clear sound of bones breaking made Emus and Huaqing quickly adjust their guns in that direction. They didn't even bother to wipe the cold sweat that was dripping down their foreheads as they stared straight at the place where the sound came from. Then they saw a bug slightly larger than the one they saw earlier run out of the person's chest. After the insect glanced at them, it quickly left their line of sight. Emus and Huaqing wouldn't overlook the bug's preemptive attack the instant it saw them. However, the bug stopped its attack in the end, glanced at them, and then left. Fear. It was not the instant destruction, but the torturous approach to death step by step. They knew what was in front of them, but they could not avoid it. It was at this moment that Mouse and Huaqing seemed to recall some of the things that had happened before. Fear. It was not the instant annihilation, but the torturous death that approached step by step. They knew what was in front of them, but they could not avoid it. The duo was silent for a few minutes. In the end, Mouse said, "Let's go take a look at the crossfield." After all, a large-scale battle happened there. They had heard the commotion from the Great Hall earlier. Huaqing could not contact Silin, so he did not object to Mouse's suggestion. Although he was mentally prepared, he could not calm down when he saw it for himself. It was like a sacrificial ceremony paved with flesh and blood, supported by the flames of war. Broken limbs and remains were everywhere, and there was not a single flat spot in the huge crossfield. The place that was once Poison Fang's recreation ground and bloody execution ground for punishing sinners was now a pile of ruins. 50,000 people had died here, but not a single complete corpse could be seen. Some of them had been eaten until only bones remained. What on earth happened here? This was Poison Fang we're talking about. The famous group of lunatics in Sector V. The duo stood at the edge of the crossfield and stared at the man at the center of the ruins with complicated gazes. A lens popped out of the device in Mouse's left eye. Through it, he could see the situation inside the crossfield clearly and record it all at the same time. There was a cross more than 5 meters tall at the center of the crossfield, and Poison Fang's emblems were piled underneath it. Mouse did not know how many emblems there were, but the fact that they were here meant that the owners of the emblems were dead. Lying on top of the emblems was a skeleton. It did not look like the skeleton of a normal human, and there were 2 rows of specialized bones at the torso. On top of the cross, Silin was sitting casually. He was holding a book in his hand and reading slowly. A gray cat was squatting on his shoulder. Its eyes were narrowed, and it looked very comfortable. Silin's voice was neither fast nor slow, but it was very comfortable. It was like a cool breeze that swept through the ruins, calming the restless heart inexplicably in this land surrounded by red sand. Emus didn't know what language it was, but the translation device translated it right away. It was standard Sector X's sector language. The dying criminal listens to the honest cries in his heart nestled in the universe in this ridiculously beautiful starry sky wind, and rain ushered in the air birds from heaven passing by the human realm. Silin ignored the arrival of Emus and Huaqing and continued to read on his own. The light that slowly rose from his back caused the man, the cat, the pile of symbols, and the cross to form a long shadow in front of him. There was a saying in the League of Stars that 50 years made a generation. It had been almost 50 years since the glory of the previous generation. Was the new generation about to rise? Mouse smiled. Poison Fang's infiltration mission was over, and if there were no accidents after he returned to the military, his peak was about to arrive. In that case, how many people would become the leaders of this new era? No matter what, Mouse was glad that his peak was in this era. Even if he could not become a leader, he could at least witness the glory of this era. Vanguard Division 6 Silin. Compared to the 6th Division's Commander Schotten, and compared to the other B Squadron commanders of Vanguard, Mouse believed that Silin was more than qualified to enter the Hunt ranking. The Hunt ranking was a ranking the military made specifically for hunters. Only the higher-ups of the military knew the names on the Hunt ranking. Anyone who was listed on the Hunt ranking would receive special treatment from the military, even more so than Skeleton King and Carano. Right now, Mouse did not know what kind of treatment this was, but perhaps he would know very soon. At this time, Silin had finished reading the poem in the book. He closed the book but did not jump down from the cross. "You're here." Chapter 129. El Mouse and Joaquin walked over. It was still the same brown-haired, honest-looking young man that Joaquin was familiar with. He still wore the same smile, but his attitude towards Celine was completely different. Facing Celine like this, El Mouse and Joaquin felt like a chill rise in their hearts at the same time. More than 20 hours had passed, and 100,000 people had been wiped out. However, the person who caused all of this still wore his usual expression and was leisurely reading a poem on a morning like this. It was as if the ruins and corpses beneath his feet were nothing more than an insignificant background. Joaquin swallowed and asked carefully, "Celine, those people from Poison Fong, they're probably dead." "Dead? They're all dead?" Joaquin opened his mouth, but didn't know what to say. Should he rejoice that the 6th Division had produced such a talent? Lieutenant Akai and the others have left on a spaceship, but I don't know the specifics. The captain will send a starship over. I don't know when it will arrive, but I believe it won't be too long. Celine said, "Is that Carreño?" El Mouse pointed at the skeleton on top of the pile of emblems and asked. "Yes." Celine nodded. Both El Mouse and Joaquin stared at the skeleton in great surprise. El Mouse clicked his tongue in wonder. So Carreño's true face has never been revealed. Although only Carreño's skeleton was left, it was obvious that Carreño was different from before. Can I collect some data?" El Mouse asked Celine. Right now, El Mouse was obviously more wary of Celine than anything else. Moreover, Carreño was Celine's prey. If he wanted to study someone else's prey, he should at least inform the hunter first, right? "That's fine. Name a price." "Name him a price?" El Mouse only reacted after a long time. He smiled and said, "Of course you can name the price. After all, the prey is yours." The inert materials Celine used to design Carreño's flying knife were very expensive, and the composition of corrosive fluids and neurotoxins also required some costs. Therefore, before making these things, Celine made a list. He couldn't lose money, right? Yes, there was also the cost of labor. Celine decisively raised a finger. 10 million. 10 million. Joaquin almost shouted. Carreño's head might be priceless, but El Mouse only needed to collect information about this skeleton. 10 million for this? El Mouse stared at Celine's eyes for a while and knew that this kid was not joking. "Sure, but I don't have that much money right now." "That's fine." Celine took out the Vanguard's special receipt and began to write it skillfully. After he was done, he handed it to El Mouse. "See if there are any other questions. If there are no questions, please sign here." El Mouse looked at the receipt in his hand. The corner of his eyes twitched, and he sighed in his heart. He really did not know where Vanguard Division 6 found such a monster. After El Mouse signed the receipt, he squatted down to look at some data about the skeleton. After seeing the data, El Mouse felt a lot more balanced. According to the data, it was indeed worth 10 million. It would have been better if the skin and flesh were still there. Unfortunately, there was only a skeleton left. It was hard to imagine that the arrogant and tyrannical Skeleton King would end up in such a state. However, when El Mouse was collecting information, he noticed a pair of eyes staring at him. At first, he thought it was Celine or Joaquin, but later he felt that something was wrong. El Mouse turned his head and saw the Huimao squatting on Celine's shoulder, staring at him with its round eyes, as if guarding against thieves. Guarding against thieves? El Mouse was puzzled. Why is a cat staring at me like that? Although Carreño did not tell El Mouse about Huimao looking for energy ores, El Mouse had his own way of finding out. Therefore, he knew that this should be the talking cat that could find energy ores. However, why would Celine bring it to such a dangerous place? Wasn't he afraid that this cat would not be able to return? The man and the cat stared at each other. Huimao had adopted a strategy of not moving if the enemy did not move. If the enemy moved, it would not move. Knowing that El Mouse was from the military, Huimao was much more careful. It was not as casual as it was with other hunters. Seeing that Huimao did not respond, El Mouse did not say anything and continued to collect data. However, Celine, that guy is cheating. Huimao suddenly shouted. Its round eyes stared straight at El Mouse, full of anger. El Mouse spread his hands helplessly. How am I cheating? Although he knew that Huimao could speak, El Mouse was still shocked by the cat's sudden voice. Even Sillin and Hua Qing, who were in the middle of a conversation, were looking at emus with the same expression. Kid, you're trying to play tricks right under our noses? You want to keep Carreño company, right? El Mouse wanted to say something, but Huimao raised its paw and pointed at El Mouse. He's shaving Huimao did not know how to describe it. Sampling, Sillin said tacitly. Yes, sampling. There's an additional fee for sampling. El Mouse's face froze. How could he collect information more accurately without sampling? Sillin looked at El Mouse and calmly took out the receipt. Name your price. Watching and El Mouse. El Mouse wanted to say, I'm not collecting anymore, but I've already signed 10 million. Wouldn't it be a waste to give up on me? Therefore, El Mouse signed another million. You don't have to pull a long face. I know you can report the debt to the higher-ups. It's not like you need to cut your own flesh. Sillin said while looking at Emu's bitter expression. Then, he handed over 2 bills. Looking at the numbers on the 2 receipts, El Mouse's eyes darkened. He pointed at Sillin with a trembling hand. You don't go too far. Carreño's bones are not worth that much. 10 million was written on each of the 2 receipts. What did I say that these 2 receipts were related to Carreño? Sillin looked at El Mouse. You've collected those 2 worms, haven't you? El Mouse froze. He did not expect Sillin to know about it. He had secretly collected samples of the 2 worms, and Watching had not noticed it. However, according to El Mouse's evaluation of the 2 worms, 10 million for each was considered cheap. Therefore, Watching watched as El Mouse signed 2 more 10 million receipts. Watching roared in his heart. Vanguard Division 6 has produced a genius. 5 hours later, a starship of the 6th Division arrived at the outskirts of the planet. Led by Shotten himself, they had tracked down the delayed signal Huimao had left behind. Although the delayed signal would be delayed, it had the advantage of concealment and could evade Poison Fong's signal detection. On the way here, they encountered the space plane carrying the unconscious Akai and the others. Other than 3 who were still in the ICU, the rest were in normal sick rooms. This allowed Shotten to breathe a sigh of relief. Originally, they hadn't placed much hope in Sillin. Carrie, Xiao Shang, and the others were even prepared to fight with everything they had, but they didn't expect the result to be like this. When they arrived at the planet, they saw the debris floating in outer space. When the people at the crossfield fell one after another, some people on the starships that had stopped outside tried to escape. Therefore, Carreño pressed the controller in his hand. There was a button on the controller that controlled the bombs installed on the starship. The people of Poison Fong only had 2 choices. They could either die in battle or be blown to pieces. Carrie and the others stared blankly at the debris outside the planet. At the same time, the signal receiver converted the received signals into information and displayed it on the big screen. Sillin did not allow them to enter the planet. He only ordered them to send out an unmanned spaceplane and forbade anyone from the 6th Division from approaching the planet. Although Shotten did not quite understand Sillin's words, he did as he was told. After the spaceplane returned, Carrie gave Sillin a heavy punch when he saw that Sillin was fine. He had been holding a grudge against Sillin's solo operation this time. You're not allowed to do something like this next time. Call us if you're going to do something. Yeah, me and Ba Dao too, Xiao Shang said while patting Sillin's shoulder. Hey, who's that guy? Carrie pointed at the meeting room door next to him with his chin. When Carrie saw the stranger who boarded the ship at the same time as Sillin and Watching, he was about to go up and take a look. However, Shotten had dragged everyone into the meeting room for a secret discussion and didn't give Carrie the chance to inquire. Ah, that's the enemy of my enemy. Sillin did not say Amao's name because the name Amao's was definitely a fake. As for what Amao's real name was in the military, Amao's probably wouldn't tell him. The people of the 6th Division did not know what method Sillin had used to completely wipe out Poison Fong, but one thing was for sure. They were starting to feel a sense of fear towards Sillin. Be it the normal personnel or the lieutenant commanders, everyone was obviously careful when they spoke in front of Sillin. Sillin had made a great contribution this time. He had saved the hostages, seized back the energy ores, and even destroyed Poison Fong. Even the A squad of Vanguard probably wouldn't have been able to accomplish such a feat with such efficiency. At the same time, Silin also told Akai, Huaqin, and the others that without Hui Mao, he could only destroy Poison Fong, but not the hostages. Therefore, it was all thanks to Hui Mao that Akai, Huaqin, and the others were able to survive. As a result, Hui Mao's status rose once more. Every time Huaqin and Akai saw Hui Mao, they would smile kindly. This also led to Hui Mao being pampered to the heavens, and his status in the 6th Division was even higher than that of a lieutenant commander. Shotten did not ask too much about Silin's actions on the planet. When Silin said that the planet would be listed as a forbidden zone for the next 100 years, Shotten agreed, without hesitation. He ordered the people of the 6th Division to not step foot on the planet for the next 100 years, and also informed Bart and Somba Leruo not to enter. Huaqin and Amaus did not object to the planet being listed as a forbidden zone in the slightest. They knew that the reason the insects did not attack them must be because of Silin. If Silin did not leave any medicine or other preventive items on them, they would have turned into a pile of bones a long time ago. After the group returned to the 6th Division's main ship, Diaz called for Silin before he could even rest. "You want me to be the lieutenant commander?" Silin glared at the smiling Diaz who was lying on the sickbed. The guy's complexion looked much better now. "No way." Silin shook his head and prepared to leave. He had overworked his brain and was so tired that he was going to shit himself. However, the door was firmly shut. He tried the door lock, but it was useless. Silin turned around to look at the one-armed Diaz. "What's wrong, uncle? Are you planning to force yourself on me?" Chapter 130. "I wouldn't dare in front of you." Diaz made an innocent expression. "At most, it's like forcing a duck onto a perch." "Then I'm really sorry, but I'm not a duck. Please find another duck." "Sigh, you know my arm." Diaz looked lonely, but he was interrupted by Silin before he could finish. "Acting pitiful is useless." "Ahem." Diaz straightened his expression. "I've discussed with Asha. After we leave Sector Z this time, the 6 squad's injured members like me will head to Sector E together. You know, Sector E is most famous for its medicine, and our injured members go there to recover. It's just that we don't know how long it will take. So after some consideration, I've decided to let you take over the position of vice captain of our squad. If you don't like it, you can hold the position for now until I return. However, I may need a long time to recuperate." Diaz was injured like this because he was protecting Asha, but it was a blessing in disguise. His relationship with Asha progressed very quickly. Silin looked at the hopeful Diaz and said, "I'm going back to sleep." "Sai, don't go. Actually, our squad usually doesn't have much to do. Beaver is the one who takes care of everything. That's why I, the vice captain, have always been relatively idle compared to the others. It's just that I'm wearing the hat of vice captain, and I'll only show up when there's something important. That's why I'm pretty idle." Diaz talked endlessly about the benefits of being a vice captain to Silin. If Silin didn't want to manage too many things, then so be it. In the past, Diaz didn't really manage things anyway, so he was a lot more at ease with Silin. Moreover, no one would object to Silin becoming a vice captain. In the end, Silin agreed. He had his own considerations. Just now, Diaz said that a vice captain's rank had higher authority to know certain information and come into contact with certain things. In other words, he would have a greater chance of finding out about the Yuki Fujihara family. Silin had no doubt that the Jin family was at a very high level. If one didn't reach that level, perhaps they wouldn't even be able to touch the surface of the Jin family. At the very least, there was no relevant information at this stage. After leaving the room, Silin touched the tattoo on his thumb. Jinya's coffin was still inside. When would he be able to send Jinya back to the Jin family? Meanwhile, in Yudi and Beaver's ward, they were out of danger. They just needed a rest for a while. Moreover, with their gene levels, their recovery speed would be much faster. At this moment, Carrie, Xiao Shang, and Tang Qiuqiu were all gathered in the ward. After being depressed for such a long time, everyone was finally in a much better mood. Tang Kukikyu, who had been silent for a few days, finally began to speak. Yudi and the Miantuan were playing a puzzle game on the microcomputer while talking to the others. Suddenly, the ward's door opened. There was no one outside, but when they looked down, they saw Hui Mao strutting in with his tail up and a proud look on his face. Looking at Yudi and Beaver, who were lying on the bed, Hui Mao said without any conscience, "You guys are so weak. You actually got beaten up like this. Everyone, don't compare us to you and that monster master of yours." Although Sillin didn't talk about the situation on that planet, from the images taken from outer space, the situation on that planet was really terrible. They really didn't expect Sillin to have such a trick up his sleeve. As soon as the Miantuan saw Hui Mao, he jumped up and ran toward him. It looked like he wanted to bond with Hui Mao, but in fact, he wanted to divert his attention because he was about to lose the game. After eating a candy that Tang Kakikyu handed to him, Hui Mao walked around in front of everyone, feeling like a leader inspecting them. Then, he nodded in satisfaction. They were all in good spirits. "Wheeze, why did the vice captain call Sillin over?" Carrie asked. Hui Mao jumped onto a high shelf and looked down at everyone. He said proudly, "Diaz is leaving for treatment, and Sillin is taking over as vice captain. Don't worry. Since I'm your vice captain, you don't have to be afraid if anything happens in the future. I'll cover for you." Is Sillin the vice captain or Master Cat the vice captain? His attitude was like a cat with the title of vice captain on his head. Everyone had expected that Diaz was leaving for Sector E to get his arm treated. They were a little surprised that Sillin was taking over as vice captain, but they didn't object to it. Carrie and the others who were familiar with him aside, even the other members of the 6th Division wouldn't object to it. After the Poison Fong incident, Sillin's prestige was very high. Yudi smiled. "That's good. Master Cat will take care of them from now on." His words were sincere. Everyone knew what Hui Mao was capable of. He had saved Carrie, Akai, and the others before, so they might need Hui Mao's help when the time came. The next day, during the 6th Division's main ship conference room, attended by Bart and Sombaleruo, Shotten announced that Sillin would be taking over Diaz as the vice captain of the 6th Division and the person in charge of the original 6th Division team. The Asha team had also appointed a new person in charge, Zaya Cha. She would take over Asha's position as vice captain. As for Asha, she was accompanying Diaz to Sector E to get his arm repaired. After the meeting was over, Bart purposely patted Sillin's shoulder twice heavily. "Good boy. Not bad. We'll be waiting for you at the A Squadron." Sombaleruo did not object to Bart's words. It was obvious that he approved of Sillin's decision. Based on Sillin's performance this time, he absolutely had the strength to enter the A Squadron. However, they did not recommend Sillin to the A Squadron immediately. Instead, they decided to wait and see for a while. Moreover, the 6th Division had gone to great lengths to find a talent like this. It would not be good to poach him away just like that. If Sillin was fine while he was still the vice captain, then Bart and Sombaleruo were prepared to promote Sillin to the A Squadron straight away. Receiving the approval of two famous A Squadron figures, Bart and Sombaleruo, Sillin's status in the 6th Division had imperceptibly risen yet again. The weapons they developed based on the energy ores were officially put to use as well. This undoubtedly boosted the 6th Division's confidence. After a period of recuperation and reorganization, the 6th Division embarked on their return journey. They had completed their mission this time, collected enough information on the planets, found special energy ores, and destroyed Poison Fong's secret base in Sector Z. These achievements were enough for them to stand out in the Vanguard squad. Moreover, they had only used half of the originally scheduled 5 years. Bard also told them that the A Squadron was prepared to allocate a huge sum of money to the 6th Division as a reward for the 6th Division's achievements this time. This way, the 6th Division would have more funds to develop themselves. At the outskirts of Sector Z, there was a very wide rock belt. More than 20 starships were parked there, and Navigator and Heaven's Birth's B squadrons were among them. The reason they were parked here was because there was only one passage in this rock belt, and only one fleet could enter at a time. Otherwise, problems would easily arise if more than one fleet entered at a time. So, looking at the current situation, there was a problem. At first, there were a few hundred regiments arguing, and no one was willing to give way to the other. All of them were saying the same thing. "Why should I let you go first?" But not long after, a B squadron from Heaven's Birth and A B Squadron for Navigator arrived almost at the same time. Therefore, the rest of the hunter regiments shut up and happily watched the 2B squadrons of the 4 great power squabble. Chapter 131. There were a few relatively safe entrances and exits at the edge of Sector Z. While it was possible to enter Sector Z from non-safe zones with better security, it was much more dangerous. Poise and Fong had entered through these dangerous zones. They were not afraid of taking risks. Bart, Somboleruo, and the others had also entered through non-safe zones. Unlike Poise and Fong, they had higher technology and the ability to withstand risks. However, under normal circumstances, the B squadrons under the other hunter regiments and the 4 great hunter regiments basically entered through the safe passageway. There was a section of rock belt at the entrance of every relatively safe zone, and there was only one official passageway in each rock belt. The rock belt beyond the range of this passageway would greatly affect starships and space planes, so normally only one fleet was allowed to pass through. In reality, the League of Stars could have opened this passageway wider, but it was limited to this size for ease of management. There was a planet at the periphery of Sector Z. It was where the League of Stars' army was stationed, and they could supervise the area around the rock belt. Who would have thought that today would be such a coincidence that all these hunter regiments had chosen this entrance, and all of them had come at this time? The League of Stars garrison on the planet was happy to see the conflict between the hunter regiments around the rock belt. It would be best if these hunter regiments could fight each other to the death, and the garrison could find them accordingly. When many hunter regiments ran into each other, they liked to show their insignia. Therefore, the hunter regiment's insignia flashed above the giant starships around the rock belt, as if they were afraid that others wouldn't know where they came from. After Navigator and Heaven's Birth starships had arrived, the other hunter regiments were obviously weaker. The 2 insignia alone were enough to scare away some hunter regiments. As expected of the Great Four, even their B squadrons were enough to intimidate others. Navigator and Heaven's Birth's B squadron starships blocked the passageway, and neither would give way to the other. They couldn't put down their pride in front of this many hunter regiments, and if they allowed the other to enter first, then it wouldn't take long before rumors spread throughout the entire galaxy. If that happened, not only would they lose their position in the hunter regiment, they would also lose face as a whole. The 2B squadrons each blocked half of the passage. If they tried to force their way through, they would definitely crash into those rock belts. On the planet where the garrison was located, the people in the surveillance room looked at the image displayed on the screen and laughed gloatingly. Suddenly, one of the surveillance personnel reported, "Sir, there's a fleet on the other side of the rock belt requesting to pass." "Oh, which department?" The officer raised his eyebrows and asked. "It's a squadron of Vanguard." The officer smiled. He didn't think that 3 of the 4 great B squadrons would be gathered here today. The officer then said, "Send them a message. Tell them that the exit here has been blocked by Navigator and Heaven's Birth, so there's no way to get through." All right. The monitoring personnel were also looking forward to the result of the 3-way collision. At the same time, the Navigators and Heaven's Birth B squadrons blocking the entrance of the passage received news that Vanguard Division 6 was about to pass through, and they were hoping that they could make way for them. Both Navigator and Heaven's Birth B squadron captains were amused when they heard this. "Vanguard Division 6? Who do you think you are? Coming out? Fine, think of a way yourself. I'm not moving anyway. Let's see what you can do about it." Not long after the communication ended, all the hunter regiments and the surveillance room on the garrison planet noticed that a fleet was coming from the other side of the passage. They really dare. Their first thought was that the other side had gone mad. Their second thought was that this was going to be a good show. At this time, all the hunter regiments had received the signal from the other side. It was a signal unique to Vanguard's B squadrons, and under normal circumstances, hunter regiments would make a corresponding retreat when they received such a signal. However, the current situation was that all the hunter regiments other than the 4 great ones had retreated to the side, and only Navigator and Heaven's Birth were fighting Vanguard. 1 against 2? Interesting. No matter which side won, it would be a rare show for them. The signal displayed on the screen indicated that the 2 sides of the passage were getting closer and closer. The Navigator and Heaven's Birth B squadrons had already given their orders, and their military systems were ready. If they really wanted to fight, they wouldn't mind opening fire right here. Moreover, there were 2 B squadrons from 2 of the 4 great ones on this side of the passage. Vanguard's 1v2 had to look at their opponents first, right? In many people's opinion, Vanguard Division 6 had acted recklessly this time. To put it bluntly, they had no idea what was good for them. However, this opinion was soon overturned. Just when Navigator and Heaven's Birth were about to open fire, the other side suddenly deviated from their flight path. This meant that the other side wasn't inside this passage, but they showed no signs of slowing down at all. What on earth are they trying to do? There was a flash of white light, and a composite starship covered in a layer of dark red energy shield charged out. Moreover, it was charging right above the Navigator and Heaven's Birth B squadrons. The rock that had been blocking the front of the composite starship was frozen by the white light, and then turned into dust when the black-red energy shield crashed into it. The black-red energy shield of the composite starship looked even stranger and more mysterious in this atmosphere. As the starship flew out, it left behind some stone fragments that had been frozen by the cold beams of light. The light reflected by these frozen fragments was incomparably gorgeous against the dark background. When the starships flew out, in the signals received by the various starships and the monitoring rooms of the garrisons, 6 consecutive sounds that sounded like accented cannons appeared in a specific rhythm, one louder than the other, interspersed with the music of beads. The data and pictures displayed on the electronic screens of some of the starships that were not heavily guarded were all jumping in the same rhythm. The hunters who heard the music felt as if their hearts were beating in sync with the music. The music slowly turned ancient and distant, like a sharp knife that pierced through every space. Above the starship, a huge saber-like cursor appeared. Although it was only a cursor, it was so sharp that everyone had the illusion that it was even more imposing than before. There was a number 6 next to the sharp knife. Vanguard Division 6. Although they didn't attack the Navigator and Heaven's Birth B squadrons, Vanguard's 6th Division had flown out of their heads. Moreover, they were wearing the distinctive dagger insignia of Vanguard when they flew out. A slap in the face. This was a slap in the face under the watchful eyes of the public. The 4 great hunter regiments had been at loggerheads all this time. There wasn't much open fighting, but there was a lot of covert fighting. Just like this time, the 2 sides didn't exchange fire at all, but the result was much more intense. After the composite starship flew out, it didn't communicate with anyone. There was only the fading sound of music and the weakening signal as the starship flew further and further away. It was like a king on a journey, leaving only a glimpse of his silhouette and the feeling of being looked up to in that instant. Chapter 132. What would the hunter regiments think? What would the 2B squadrons from Navigator and Heaven's Birth think? What would the garrison at Sector Z analyze? Vanguard 6B squadron couldn't be bothered to care about those things. The main reason Schotten chose such a forceful approach was because of Bart's words. Be forceful when you should be. Somba Leruo's evaluation of Schotten was that he was overly cautious and lacked dominance. If he did not change, then the 6th Division could only linger around the same spot, no matter how great their gains were. In order to lead the 6th team further, Schotten chose a more forceful approach this time. After all, the newly developed weapon had given him a lot of confidence. 2.5 years later, the 6th team exited Sector Z. Maybe it was because Sector Z was a little traumatized, but it felt like everywhere was heaven after they left. Sector Z was filled with irregular magnetic fields, constant ion storms, high radiation, and strange creatures. They had to be careful almost everywhere they went, so they felt like their breathing was a lot smoother after they left Sector Z. Although the news of the elimination of Skeleton King and Carreño was not widely publicized, everyone in the circle knew about it. The 4 great hunter regiments, the military, and some major forces all knew about it. However, not many people knew that Sillin was the one who actually destroyed Poison Fang's base. This was Sillin's own idea. He did not want to be too ostentatious, so it was better if the name Sillin appeared less often. After all, This name could stir up too many people's sensitive nerves, and those people were not easy to pacify once they were stirred. After they left Sector K, the extra time in the 5-year plan was given to everyone as usual. Some people would return to their hometowns to rest for a while before meeting up with the fleet, and some would follow the fleet to Sector K. Sector K was the gathering place of the 4 great hunter regiments. It was the only sector dominated by hunter regiments in the League of Stars, and it was practically heaven for hunters. This was also one of the reasons why Scylla decided to go to Sector K before he joined Vanguard Division 6. Every time a 5-year mission was completed, the B squadrons would return to Sector K. They would come into contact with the A squadrons, report their results, and hand over certain things. In the past, every time they went to Sector K and came into contact with the A squadron and other B squadrons, the 6th squad couldn't even straighten their backs, and they almost felt like they were invisible characters. But this time, they were emboldened. Even Barths and Sombaleruo had praised the 6th squad, so the other people's opinions were more or less the same. Therefore, the 6 squad's return to Sector K this time was a little excited even as they remembered the dead. Other than the energy blocks, Shotten had also returned with the Skeleton King, Caranio's remains, and some emblems made from Poison Fong's bones. Caranio could be considered an overlord, so his death would have a certain impact. It was best to leave Caranio's death to the A Squadron. After the A Squadron dealt with him, they would also erase some secrets they did not want others to know. This was also what Scylla hoped for. Imaz would be brought to the A Squadron at Sector K. There, Shotten and the A Squadron would negotiate with the military. The military would have to pay a price to redeem Imaz, and the outcome was basically up to the A Squadron. As for the remaining Poison Fong members at Sector V, it was also a good opportunity for the military to win the hearts of the people. The military would not be too stingy if they could learn more about Poison Fong. Of course, this was also a great contribution from the 6th Division. Shotten still had to ask the A Squadron for the promised development funds. Scylla had been sleeping ever since the meeting. He had overused his brain, and his brain had been calculating at high speed during the incident with Poison Fong. He hadn't really rested at all, so Scylla only woke up after the fleet left Sector Z. Shotten asked Scylla about his plans, and Scylla thinks for a moment. Although he was now carrying the burden of a lieutenant commander, he still had 2 years of rest, and there was basically nothing to do. There was still plenty of time, so Scylla decided to return to Sector X and take a look. He would walk around every sector, and no one would know that he was the one who eliminated Poison Fong and killed Caranio anyway. It would be a good distraction to look around. When the time came, he would meet up with everyone at Sector K. Shotten did not object to Scylla's idea. He told Scylla some information about Vanguard's communication with the Hunter Regiment and told Scylla to be careful. Contact him if he had any difficulties and that Vanguard would support him from behind. This was the benefit of joining a Hunter Regiment. At the very least, he would have a big hand supporting him from behind. Carey was preparing to return to Sector K and meet up with his friends from the other B squadrons. Ba Dao was going back for a while. Xiao Shang was going with the fleet since his birthplace was Sector K in the first place. Yudi and Beaver needed to recuperate, so they stayed on the starship and moved with the main force. Diaz had brought the wounded to Sector E for treatment, and they would see a whole person the next time they met. However, Tang Qiuqiu was prepared to follow Scylla. She felt that she would be happier following Scylla. After the decision was made, Scylla greeted Shotten and informed the rest of the squad. Then, he took Tang Qiuqiu and Hui Mao and piloted a small space plane to Sector X's transit planet when the starship passed by Sector X. After the spaceport's identity verification and danger inspection, the spaceplane landed on Planet X, C-100. Planet X, C-100, was an important transportation hub and transit station for Sector X. It had a special port for private space planes and private planes to stop at, and it could also be used to help watch over things. Scylla parked the space plane at an empty spot, went through the procedures, and paid the corresponding fee. Then, he went out to forage for food with Tang Qiuqiu and Hui Mao. When Tang Qiuqiu heard that Scylla had met Diaz here, she strongly requested to go to the restaurant near the airport. After 3 years, she came to this restaurant again. It was still the same, and it was still served by a robot and a waitress together. However, the waitress was no longer the one in her memories, and Sillin himself was no longer the same as before. Sillin told Tang Qiuqiu about the time he met Dias all those years ago, and Tang Qiuqiu giggled so hard that she didn't even bother to wipe the ice cream stuck to her nose. Hui Mao, on the other hand, didn't have much interest in the past at all. Instead, it stared at the flying cars flying everywhere outside the transparent window, its round eyes filled with interest. It thought to itself how interesting it would be if it could take a picture of those flying cars one by one. Sillin didn't plan to fly a space plane over. It was inconvenient to go through too many procedures. After eating his fill, he took a stroll around the area and then boarded the flight to Planet X, C-362. Pets were not allowed on a passenger plane, and if you really wanted to bring a pet along, you must put it in a specific cabin on the plane. Hui Mao was an exception. However, it could stay in a corner of the plane and roll around without anyone noticing. When he saw that familiar planet and the satellite arrays around it again, Sillin felt a different feeling in his heart. It had been 3 years, and he was back. Chapter 133. Planet X, C-362, Planet Brown Earth. It was still the same as it was 3 years ago. Nothing had changed, but after seeing the prosperity of the 10 trade zones, even the most upscale district of Planet Brown Earth paled in comparison. Luxuriously dressed, pretentious upscale people could be seen everywhere on the streets, walking with arrogant eyes, as usual. Guarding an inch of land and living their own lives was a joy to them. Pretty good. At least most of them were self-satisfied and happy with what they had. Old Devon had opened a small shop in the city and had also hired people from the slums to help. He was living a good life now. Having a son in his old age, old Devon always had a smile on his face. At least when Sillin saw him, old Devon was always smiling happily. Tang Qiuqiu held a large cup of ice cream in one hand and a lollipop in the other. She ate happily, occasionally looking around curiously. Hui Mao was clamoring to take a flying car. He had originally planned to take a train, but at Hui Mao's request, Sillin took a flying car instead. He hailed a taxi, gave the destination, and the flying car rose into the air and flew away. Sillin did not allow Hui Mao to talk nonsense outside, so Hui Mao expressed all of his emotions through his round eyes. He stared unblinkingly at the flying cars in front and behind the taxi, and could not help but move his claws. There was no other way. His claws itched, and he wanted to pat them. Sillin looked at the scenery outside the taxi window. This planet was still the same. If it was in the 10 trade zones, there would probably be a lot of changes every year. The development of lagging sectors was much slower. When Tang Qiuqiu finished the ice cream in her hand, they arrived at their destination. Although this was only the edge of the slums, they could clearly feel the great difference from the prosperous areas in front. "Brother Sillin, is this your birthplace?" Tang Qiuqiu asked. In her heart, there was no such thing as a hometown, only the concept of birthplace, and she had no feelings for this concept at all. "Yes." Sillin took a deep breath. The air was still a mixture of dust and decadence. Hui Mao squatted on Sillin's shoulder and snorted occasionally. It was obvious that Hui Mao despised this place, especially since he had just come from the bustling city center. The contrast was even more obvious. He really didn't expect Sillin to be born in such a broken place. The poor houses were still the same, and the garbage dump was still the same. However, there were fewer people, and there were more abandoned houses. Walking along the familiar street, he came to the door of a bar. This was the bar that old David had given to Sillin. It was also the small shop that Sillin had worked in for many years. Before he left, he had sublet it to Er Chung, who used to live in the same slum. Sillin had checked the original savings card. For the past 3 years, Carrie would have an extra sum of money every year, and it was always on time. Although this amount of money was nothing to Sillin, it was enough to show Er Cheng's character. Sillin was very satisfied. Er Cheng's brother, De Chung, used to live in the slums as well. However, De Chung was ruthless and risked his life to work in a high-radiation area. Unexpectedly, his genotype evolved from rank F to rank E, and he officially stepped into the city. However, Er Chung didn't have the guts. He was satisfied as long as he could live peacefully. That was why when Sillin rented the bar to Air Chung, he was very happy. Now, it seemed that Air Chung had been living well for the past 3 years. Sillin was no longer the same as he was 3 years ago. No one could recognize him. The shop's business wasn't good, but it was passable. Sillin didn't stay at the bar for long. Instead, he went to Jinya's house. The AI robots had been taking care of the house, so it wasn't very dirty. The Fuji tree hadn't grown at all, and it looked exactly the same as it did 3 years ago. After looking around, Sillin contacted an intermediary and bought the abandoned houses. He sent the blueprints to them and asked them to build according to the blueprints. At the same time, Sillin transferred all the money to them and even paid a little more. The intermediary was very happy and promised that they would do a good job. Sillin used another identity to go through the relevant procedures. After obtaining the ownership of the houses, he left the rest of the matters to the intermediary. They would supervise the completion. Sillin had savings on hand, and they were all galactic credits, which could be exchanged for even more sector credits. He wouldn't mind even if he had to buy the entire slums. However, Sillin chose to let this slum town develop on its own. He didn't want to interrupt this town's pace. Sillin also learned some things. The reason why there were fewer people here was mainly because of the chain reaction brought about by a newly developed planet, Planet X, C369, not far from Planet X, C362. Planet X, C369 was originally a planet that was much poorer than Planet Brown Saturn. It was much more backward, and this planet's habitability was only grade B. In other words, if one wanted to migrate to Planet X, C369, they would need more facilities to support it. These facilities would cost a lot of money, and this was also the reason why no one had paid attention to this planet for so many years. However, 3 years ago, not long after Sillin left Planet Brown Saturn, Planet X, C369 was inadvertently spotted by an investigator from the Phoenix family, a famous family in the League of Stars. The investigator obtained the rights to develop and manage the planet, and thus the planet's fate changed from then on. It was named Little Garden. Little Garden was twice the size of Planet Brown Earth. Its development required a large amount of labor, and the one thing Sector X did not lack the least was cheap labor. Planet Brown Earth, which was relatively close to Little Garden, provided almost 1/5 of the total labor force. Of course, these labor forces were of higher quality, and even the lowest genotype was rank E. Since Planet Brown Earth had lost a large amount of labor force from the city center, it gave the people of the slums a chance. Some of the strong and healthy F-rank genotypes were able to find a job at the city center of Planet Brown Earth, and that was why the slum population was decreasing. In just a year's time, Planet X, C369, which was originally in an almost primitive state, had changed greatly. It truly lived up to its name, becoming a beautiful and colorful garden. Right now, Little Garden had become famous in Sector X thanks to the Phoenix family's promotion. Moreover, it had become one of the more important tourist planets under the Phoenix family. Every day, people from all over the League of Stars would come to visit due to its fame. Do you want to take a look at Little Garden? Sillin asked Tang Chiochio and Hui Mao while holding a flyer for Little Garden. Yes, yes, they answered in unison, looking very expectant. The image on the flyer was too attractive. All right, then our next stop will be Little Garden. Let's take a look at the legendary Sea of Flowers. There was a direct flight to Little Garden on Planet Brown Saturn, but Sillin had already applied for a pet certificate for Hui Mao. The inspection station outside of Little Garden was under stricter management, and while it was possible to sneak past it, Hui Mao would still have to come out once he reached the planet. In order to prevent more problems from happening in the future, Sillin decided to apply for a pet certificate without hesitation. However, the word pet caused Hui Mao to grit his teeth. He thought for a moment and decided to forget about it. He wouldn't stay in the designated pet cabin for too long anyway. He would arrive after a nap. Little Garden? That sounds pretty good. Chapter 134. Everyone knew that Little Garden wasn't small at all. It was twice the size of Planet Brown Earth, but there was an endless stream of people coming and going on this planet every day. The entire Little Garden planet was practically filled with people. The Feniers family's businesses were relatively strict in all aspects. The direct passenger plane stopped at the spaceport outside of Little Garden. Similar to Seven Lights University, the passengers had their identities checked at the spaceport before boarding a specialized carrier plane to enter the planet. Before they even entered the spaceport, the passengers on the passenger plane began to get excited. The colorful and dreamy planet could be seen from the cabin windows and display screens. It was truly fascinating. After the checks were done, Silin led Tang Kukikyu into the specialized carrier plane. As for Hui Mao, it continued to squat in the pet cabin of the carrier plane. The moment they landed and stepped out of the carrier plane, the fragrance of flowers assaulted their nostrils. It was rich but not cloying, but the moment they walked out of the port, the fragrance changed. It became simple, elegant, fresh, and pleasant. The moment they stepped out of the carrier plane, the fragrance of flowers changed almost every few steps they took. There were all kinds of scents, and flower beds of all sizes and shapes could be seen everywhere. There were even some vine-like flowers hanging in the air. That was so suffocating. Hui Mao shook its fur, raised its butt, and stretched its back before jumping on his Silin's shoulder. Its cat head twisted and turned continuously as it looked at the surrounding scenery in astonishment. On this planet, be it the buildings or the means of transportation, they were all in the shape of flowers or carved with flower patterns. They inherited the diversity of flowers and filled this planet with the dreamy colors of a fairy tale. Silin was going to rent a means of transportation, a flower car. This was an indispensable tool for the tourists who came here. It looked like a small carriage, except it was in the shape of a flower. There were tables and chairs inside, and the tourists could sit on it to eat, drink, chat, and admire the flowers. The speed, route, and so on could all be adjusted. It was very convenient. When they arrived at the flower car rental point, Silin looked at the display screen and asked Tang Kikikyu, "Which one do you want?" There were all kinds of flower cars on the screen, and it was dazzling. Tang Xiuqiu pursed her lips and looked at them for a long time. In the end, she chose the Lily of the Valley car. The flower car was like Lily of the Valley, white and bell-shaped. It was very cute. Since there were only 2 people and a cat, Silin chose a small flower car. After paying, a card popped up next to the machine. It was the proof of rental and the key to the flower car. At the same time, a 2-meter-tall Lily of the Valley car automatically drove out of the station. After scanning the card on the door of the flower car opened, and the fragrance of Lily of the Valley wafted out. After entering the float and setting up the control panel, 3 sofa chairs and a small round table popped out. The chairs were soft and looked like they were sitting on the petals of a lily of the valley. Silin had set up a short route. First, he had to go to a few nearby shops to buy some food and other necessities. Tang Kikikyu bought ice cream and candy, Hui Mao's codfish burger and fish biscuits of various flavors, and Silin also bought some food to fill their stomachs. One had to admit that the service at the place managed by the Feniers family was pretty good. The quality of the food was also very good, and it wasn't too expensive. Silin even bought a palm-sized, flower-shaped camera for Tang Kukikyu to play with. The 2 people and the cat took a photo as a memento. The Lily of the Valley car floated on the passage. Silin had set the speed and route. Right now, all they had to do was sit in the car and eat, chat, and admire the scenery outside. 80% of Little Garden was a scenic area, which was enough for the tourists to see. There were intersecting floating passages in the scenic area. After the parade route was set, the float car would drive on these passages and bring the tourists to enjoy the scenery. Although they had felt that there were flowers everywhere before, it was only after entering the scenic area that they deeply felt like they had entered a sea of flowers. As far as the eye could see, there was an endless sea of flowers. Above the sea of flowers, there were some butterfly bees flying around. Butterfly bees looked a lot like butterflies. They had large, colorful wings, but lived like bees. They would collect nectar, but they wouldn't harm the garden like butterfly larvae. The manager of Little Garden had even specially built some beehives for them. All kinds of butterfly bees danced among the flowers, adding a lot of liveliness to the sea of flowers. The colorful world the overwhelming scenery, and the refreshing fragrance of flowers all caused one to stop and linger in their tracks. The scenery at every stop was different. Even though the previous stop was already eye-catching enough, they didn't expect to see something else at the next stop. It was hard to comment. There was a monitor in the float car that would display the information of the area it passed, the types of flowers, the names of the scenic area, and so on, so that the tourists could better understand it. Rainbow Bridge. Big Brother Sillin, let's go through Rainbow Bridge. Okay. Sillin adjusted the route, and the float car drove toward Rainbow Bridge. Tourists who came here would adjust their route to pass through Rainbow Bridge. Rainbow Bridge was an arched passage surrounded by flowers of 7 colors. From a distance, it looked like a rainbow. At the same time, there were some special suspension devices floating above and around Rainbow Bridge. They were all white like clouds, and water droplets sprayed from them, adding a bit of fun. The children passing by stretched their hands out of the window to catch the water droplets. Tang Chocho was no exception. She could hear their laughter from afar. Tang Chocho also carried Hui Mao out of the window and drenched him with water droplets. Hui Mao was also having fun. He shook his ears and shook his head, throwing water droplets on Tang Chocho. He opened his mouth to drink water, and the water droplets that sprayed out had the sweetness of nectar. Wow, look, there's a cat. On a float car in front, a 4 or 5-year-old child poked his head out and smiled, pointing at Hui Mao, who Tang Chocho carried out of the window. The gray cat even waved its paw in the direction of the little fellow, causing the little fellow in front of it to become incredibly excited. The little fellow tossed a bag of fish fillets at the gray cat, and the gray cat caught it with its paw before smiling so widely that its eyes turned into crescents. After passing Rainbow Bridge, a huge figure appeared in the sea of flowers, Flower Goddess, a figure made entirely of flowers. The girl made of flowers looked very demure. White flowers formed the wings on her back, and a long skirt decorated with flowers of various colors. In this sea of flowers, there was a feeling of strolling in a courtyard, very beautiful. Tang Chocho was holding the camera and taking pictures. Sillin poked her little face and said, "Chocho, there's honey over there. Do you want to try it? Sugar?" Tang Chocho's eyes lit up. She looked in the direction that Sillin was pointing. Not far ahead, there was a small shop that sold honey and other nectar. Nectar and flower tea were all specialties of Little Garden. After all, in the League of Stars, it was very difficult to find a place that was better than here. In this kind of pure environment, the quality of the nectar in Little Garden was also very good. Needless to say, the honey they made was naturally very good. Looking at the information on the menu, Tang Chocho bit her finger. It was really too difficult to choose. In the end, she temporarily chose 10 types of honey and would buy them when she encountered such a shop in the future. After buying the sweets, Sillin decided to rest at a stop. There was a plaza here, and tourists could park their float cars here and walk out to get some fresh air. Tang Chocho sat on a flower-shaped wooden stool and showed Sillin the scenery that she had taken along the way. Just as she was talking, she was interrupted by a young and angry roar. Get lost! Chapter 135. This roar attracted the attention of all the tourists around them. They saw a flying car with a unique design hovering in the air. Below the flying car were a few bodyguard-like figures, as well as an old man dressed meticulously like an official surrounding a boy around 10 years old. The old man had a helpless look on his face, but he didn't look annoyed. Instead, his eyes were filled with love. Sillin knew that people who could use a flying car in a place like this were definitely not ordinary tourists. After all, the management of this planet was rather strict. It seemed that this group of people had quite a background. Even if they weren't from the Feniers family, they were at least closely related to the Feniers family. The one who yelled "Get lost" just now was that young master. Just by looking at his attire, one could tell that he was definitely the young master of some family. Moreover, the way that little guy looked at the people around him with disdain and arrogance in his eyes made Sillin think that he was pride. The little guy's face was filled with anger at the moment. One of the bodyguards moved a step to the side and was glared at by the little guy. The bodyguard had no choice but to retract his foot and stand still like a statue. This was clearly the temper of a young master. It did look a little unreasonable. You just told him to get lost just now, but you got glared at right after you moved a step. What are you trying to do? He didn't know what the surrounding tourists were thinking, but at least Tang Qiuqiu couldn't stand it. However, she couldn't be bothered. She nudged Hui Mao with her elbow and pointed at an image displayed on the camera. Ignore them. Let's continue watching. Wheeze, what do you think of this one? The image was taken by Silin when they were crossing the Rainbow Bridge. Tang Qiuqiu pushed Hui Mao out of the car window, and the scattered water droplets reflected a rainbow of colors. Hui Mao moved closer to the other side, and his entire head blocked the image. Obviously, he liked this image very much. You're blocking me. Move to the side a little. Tang Qiuqiu scratched the fur on Hui Mao's head with a smile. In fact, after the young master shouted just now, the surrounding people unconsciously became silent or only whispered to each other. Therefore, Tang Qiuqiu's voice, which was not suppressed at all, seemed a little abrupt. At the same time, it was obvious that Tang Qiuqiu had completely ignored everyone else and was talking to Hui Mao. The young master glared at Tang Qiuqiu, but both Tang Qiuqiu and Hui Mao were staring at the camera and completely ignored his gaze. The young master was so angry that his face turned red. He had never met someone who ignored him like this. This was simply unforgivable. Bastard. Although it was only 2 words, these 2 words were sonorous and powerful. It was even more imposing than the previous scram. He really deserved to be the young master of a big family. The surrounding people sighed in their hearts. However, it was a pity for the little girl. These people didn't seem to be easy to deal with. Everyone looked at Tang Qiuqiu with sympathy. Silin had been observing the old man. Although it seemed that the bodyguard were looking at the young master, the real person in charge was the old man, who looked like a butler. However, the good thing was that the old man didn't show any malice. Hearing the young master's rather imposing roar, Tang Qiuqiu raised her head and glanced at him. The meaning of that glance was obvious. Don't shout, don't disturb us from watching the video. Tang Qiuqiu's obviously disdainful glance made the young master's face turn from red to black. He was so angry that he almost jumped up. However, slowly, the child seemed to have thought of something and his anger slowly subsided. Instead, he had a strange and malicious smile. The old man next to him raised his eyebrows. He had a bad feeling. The little young master raised his chin high and put on the airs of a young master as he walked step by step towards Tang Qiuqiu. At the same time, following the little fellow's movements, the few bodyguards and the old man also followed closely beside him. Seeing that Tang Qiuqiu and Hui Mao still treated him as heir, the young master raised an arrogant smile and raised his finger to Tang Qiuqiu opposite him. He said to the old man next to him, "Don't you need bodyguards? She's the one." Tang Qiuqiu turned off the camera, took out a honey candy, and put it in her mouth. She jumped off the wooden stool and took Silin's hand. "Let's go. We've rested well. Let's continue to enjoy the flowers." She didn't want to talk to this crazy young master. "Stop." Following the boy's voice, a few bodyguards blocked the path in front of Silin and Tang Qiuqiu. Silin stopped Tang Qiuqiu from kicking him and looked at the old man. The old man gave him an apologetic look and stepped forward to introduce himself without losing decorum. "My name is Costella, and this is my family's young master. I wonder if I might have the honor of treating the 2 of you to afternoon tea?" Tang Qiuqiu looked at Silin. She knew that she couldn't speak carelessly in a situation like this. The other party was going to use force. Silin looked at the old man and said with a smile, "Then I'll have to trouble you." When Costella introduced himself just now, he deliberately revealed a symbol on his sleeve. It was the emblem of the Feniers family. Since the other party didn't make things ugly and offered a ladder for you to step down, wouldn't it be the same as forcing the other party to throw a tantrum if you didn't step down? Moreover, this planet was the Feniers family's territory to begin with. Even if they wanted to make trouble, they wouldn't go so far as to offend the local bully. Silin believed that the old man in front of him wouldn't go so far as to deal with them, just because of this. Therefore, Silin agreed to Costella's suggestion. The little boy looked at Tang Qiuqiu smugly and beckoned for the flying car, which had stopped in the air, to descend. This flying car was very big, about the same size as a large flower car. However, the interior was much more luxurious. Silin and Tang Qiuqiu went inside and sat down. Hui Mao jumped into Tang Qiuqiu's arms and allowed Tang Qiuqiu to tickle it. The bodyguards took their seats at the back and front. There were only 4 people in the middle. Silin and Tang Qiuqiu sat opposite the young master and Costella. Tang Qiuqiu didn't give the person opposite her a friendly look. She merely looked at Hui Mao in her arms and scratched its chin. The flying car rose into the air and stopped after flying for a short distance. A small tea table popped up in the middle of the room. Costella picked up the teapot and poured 4 cups of tea. Costella was the first to state that this was a misunderstanding. He had no choice but to bring Silin and Tang Qiuqiu up here. After all, it wouldn't be good for their reputation if they continued to cause trouble down there. Secondly, Costella expressed that this young master's suggestion was also a misunderstanding. However, before he could finish speaking, the young master forcefully interrupted Costella's words. I said, let her be a bodyguard. Didn't you say yesterday that you wanted to add more bodyguards? Just nice. Let's use her. Tang Qiuqiu had a strange expression on her face. She moved closer to Silin's ear and whispered, Big Brother Xiaoshang once said that those who let a woman protect are all gigolos who live off women. Although Tang Qiuqiu's voice wasn't loud, Costella and the young master would definitely be able to hear her since they were so close. Tang Qiuqiu didn't intend to hide it from them in the first place. She was purposely letting the young master hear her. The old man didn't have much of a reaction, but the young master was infuriated. He slammed his palm on the tea table in front of him. Who do you think you are? Letting you be my bodyguard is already an honor for you. How dare you mock me? A brat who doesn't know anything. You're not even as tall as me, shorty, gigolo, ugly freak. Silin and the old man watched as their children slammed the table and glared at each other, arguing until spittle flew everywhere. Both of them remained calm and said nothing. Bang! Tang Qiuqiu slammed her fist on the table and gritted her teeth. She wanted nothing more than to send this annoying bastard flying with a kick. She used to do whatever she wanted in Sector V in the past, and there were plenty of times when she would be served with a gun at the slightest disagreement. But after joining the 6th Division, she had toned down a lot. Still, this guy in front of her really pissed her off. Tang Qiuqiu turned around and asked Silin, according to the rules, I can accept missions during my free time, right? Silin thinks for a moment. Sure. All right. Tang Qiuqiu looked at the brat in front of her. If the pay is good and it's within my free time, then I'll accept the mission to protect you, gigolo. The young master looked at Tang Qiuqiu disdainfully. How much pay can someone like you be worth? You overestimate yourself. I might as well hire someone from the Big Four. The Big Four referred to the 4 great hunter regiments. Tang Qiuqiu paused for a moment. She seemed to be hesitating about something. Silin took a sip of tea and said, Go. I'll be at the back if anything happens. The corner of Tang Qiuqiu's lips curled when she heard Silin's words. She fished out the item hanging around her neck and slapped it on the table. I am Tang Qiuqiu, a member of the 6th Division of the Vanguard of the Big Four Hunter Regiments. Gigolo Young Master, may I know the price of the Big Four's hunter rewards? Chapter 136. Looking at the dagger-shaped emblem with a 6 on it that Tang Qiuqiu had slapped on the table, even Costella was a little stunned, much less this young master. He couldn't tell that it was actually one of the Great Four. Naturally, Costella could tell whether the emblem was real or fake. That was why he was surprised that Vanguard actually had such a young hunter. Moreover, with Costella's knowledge, he could tell from the emblem that this little girl was a core member of the B Squadron. Vanguard Division 6. This is fake, right? The young master's face was red as he roared angrily, but it was obvious that his kidneys were lacking. Tang Qiuqiu let out a humph and put the emblem back on her neck. She carried Hui Mao back on her lap, scratched Hui Mao's chin, and said, Some people just can't take a loss, can they? Hui Mao narrowed his eyes and gave face by meowing. The young master was so angry that he almost flipped the table. Costella straightened his expression. My apologies. So you're Vanguard's hunters. I hope you won't blame me for my slight neglect just now. Actually, With Castella's identity, there was no need for him to be so polite to the hunters of 2B squadrons, even if they were members of one of the Great Four, Vanguard. However, the main reason Castella was acting this way was because of the 6 on Tang Kikikyu's emblem. Vanguard Division 6. He had recently received many secret reports regarding this B squadron, and according to his understanding, this B squadron had a strong momentum to rise. Since your hunters of Vanguard, then I need to reintroduce myself. This is my young master, Fenir's Tobo, and I'm his servant. Welcome to Fenir's Little Garden. Since Castella said that he would reintroduce himself, it meant that it was time for Sillin to introduce himself. Sir Sillin put down his teacup and took out his own emblem, Vice Commander of Vanguard Division 6, Sillin. Sorry for the interruption. Castella's eyelids twitched. Vice Commander. This young man in front of him was actually the Vice Commander of Vanguard Division 6. Now, Castella really had to admit that he was blind. Such a young vice captain and such a young member were truly astonishing. The flying car left the scenic area and landed at a manor. This was the Fenir's family's private lodging area. Tang Xiuqiu and Hui Mao were sitting in a reception room. The servants brought out all kinds of pastries. Tang Xiuqiu and Hui Mao ate happily, completely ignoring Tobo, who had a cold expression on his face. Sillin and Castella went to another meeting hall. Castella told Sillin about the mission this time, and, at the same time, explained the relevant issues. The Fenir's family's young master, Tobo, was bored at home, and he just so happened to hear that a group of people from the family were heading to Sector XS Little Garden for supervision work. Therefore, he asked his parents to agree to accompany them to Little Garden to relax. Since the young master was going on a journey, it was only natural that the security work had to be done well. There were even a few corvettes, but not long after they arrived at Little Garden, they received a request for help from another of the family's properties in Sector X. Half of the bodyguards had gone over to support them, but the number of bodyguards was insufficient. The young master had also grown tired of playing here, and the personnel who were transferred away had not returned even when the original return time arrived. For the sake of Tobo's safety, Castella did not act according to Tobo's wishes. If they were to leave and return now, the accompanying bodyguards would be insufficient, and it would be easy for something to happen. As for the reason why Tobo was angry earlier, it was because he did not have the patience to stay here any longer. In a fit of pique, he took the float out to relax. In the end, he was still annoyed by the bodyguards around him, and that was why he started yelling at the resting plaza. Do you think that there's something fishy going on here? Sillin asked. Indeed. Castella did not try to hide it either. You know that many children of big families have experienced being held hostage or kidnapped, let alone a big family like the Fenir's family. Those who have the guts to act are all strong, and they're not easy to deal with. Not to mention that they are hiding in the dark. Of course, Sillin, who had once worked with the heir of the Duan's family, Aflon, understood the twists and turns in this matter. Otherwise, Aflon would not have asked Sillin to pretend to be his son back then. As far as I know, a big family at the level of the Fenir's family would protect their young children very well. But why did they take the risk and agree to let little young Master Tobo come to Sector X from Sector F? The distance between Sector F and Sector X could be considered to be quite far. Even if something were to happen, distant waters would not be able to put out a nearby fire. Moreover, Tobo was still young. He was only 10 years old. He did not even have much ability to protect himself. Castella smiled proudly when he heard this. The Fenir's family places great importance on the safety of their children, but the process of growth is just as important. The people of the Fenir's family cannot be afraid of things, and they cannot give up just because there is danger. They need to train, and this age is also the best time to broaden their horizons. Sillin nodded in agreement. It was true that if they were kept in a greenhouse, they would either grow up to be a prodigal or a man who lived off a woman. Take Lung, C.I. Jinsheng, Knight, and the others, for example. Which one of them did not have a deep background, but their individual strength was also extremely strong. This was inseparable from their own training. Giving might not necessarily bring about rewards, but wanting to reap rewards without giving was bullshit. How long does the mission last? Sillin asked. If those bodyguards still don't return after 3 days, we will immediately leave and return to Sector F. The mission will end when we arrive safely at Sector F. All right, but I must make something clear first. Tang Xiuqiu is the only one who has accepted this mission. As for me, I have no choice. My own child needs to grow up, so I have to keep an eye on her. The reason Silin did not interfere with Tang Xiuqiu's actions was because he wanted to give Tang Xiuqiu some experience. As a hunter, she would accept free missions sooner or later. Since Silin did not participate in this mission directly, Costella only had to pay Tang Xiuqiu for the mission reward. The base reward was 1 million, and another 1 million would be paid after the mission was successful. Originally, Costella had only prepared a base reward of 500,000, but when he saw Tang Xiuqiu blow up a butterfly beat outside the manor with a raise of her hand after receiving a gun, he raised the price without hesitation. Costella sighed, as expected of someone from the vanguard. This girl's gun sense was just too good. She did not need to take time to aim. She fired the gun at the first moment she felt it. She did not even need to look at the result to know that she had hit the target. Food and lodging were included during the mission. For Tang Xiuqiu, who had accepted a free mission for the first time, this was indeed a huge sum of money. Tang Xiuqiu felt as if the road ahead was filled with honey. Although she was excited, she still had to read the agreement seriously. Diaz had said that she could not be careless with the agreement. If someone were to take advantage of a loophole, then she would not be able to do anything about it, even if she cried when the time came. After she felt that there were no mistakes, she signed the agreement and officially began the mission. Tang Xiuqiu signed the mission agreement, while Silin signed a different agreement. He had to abide by some of the rules of not participating in the mission. At night, Silin lay on the bed while Hui Mao lay next to him. Because of the mission, Tang Xiuqiu slept in the room next to Tobo's bedroom. Silin, why did this coconut silk family or whatever let Xiuqiu be that young master's bodyguard? Wouldn't it be better to hire someone more capable? Hui Mao wagged his tail from time to time. A big family like the Fenier's family usually wouldn't hire a hunter as their bodyguard. They trust the people they nurture more, so that old fox Costella must have some reason that he didn't tell us. Still, no matter what, this is a pretty good growth experience for Xiuqiu, said Silin. That's true. Besides, Xiuqiu can get 2 million for this mission. She said she'll treat me to a fish feast when the time comes. Go to sleep, foodie. You can even taste a fish feast in your dreams. Hui Mao snorted twice, curled his body into a ball, and hugged his head as he slept. In the middle of the night, Silin opened his palm, and a few flying insects flew out. Silin looked at the direction they were flying in, and with a wave of his hand, he put them away again. Chapter 137. Although everyone knew that Tang Xiuqiu had become young Master Tobo's personal bodyguard, they treated it like a child throwing a tantrum. The fact that Silin and Tang Xiuqiu were part of Vanguard's 6th Division was only known by Costella and a few others. In the few days before he left Little Garden, the young master was still bored. Since he had a new bodyguard, he brought Tang Xiuqiu, the little bodyguard, out for a stroll. Silin and the other bodyguards followed them not far away. Sitting in the small flower car, Silin and Hui Mao were playing chess. Since Hui Mao had seen the Mianhuan and Yudi playing chess before, he got excited and wanted to play a few rounds with Silin. It had to be said that since he was a cyborg, he had powerful computing abilities, so he was pretty good at chess. However, it was not enough to play chess with powerful computing abilities alone. In comparison, Silin's mind was more flexible than Hui Mao's, so Hui Mao was always in a passive state. Beep! Hui Mao lowered his head and stared at the chessboard for a long time before he shamelessly pressed the reset button. He lost again. Silin looked out the window and ignored Hui Mao, who was rolling on the table. Hui Mao rolled back and forth on the table, groaning for a long time. We saw that Silin was ignoring him. He raised his paw and hooked Silin's sleeve. Ignored. Hooked again. Still ignored. Hui Mao was angry after a long time without any results. He even vented his resentment for losing the game. He leaped, jumped onto Silin's head, and started ruining his hairstyle. Silin raised his hand and flicked Hui Mao's head, then pointed outside the window. Look over there. Hui Mao spat out the hair in his mouth and looked in the direction Silen's finger was pointing. There were people in wedding dresses taking videos. There were often newlyweds coming from afar to take videos. There was nothing special about it. He had seen many of them since the first day. What's so good about taking wedding photos? Could it be that Silen wants to get married? If you want to get married, you have to find a rich, beautiful, fertile, and not a prodigal. That's what Carrie said. I'll ask him when I see him. Silen pulled Hui Mao's ear. You're so stupid. Who said that? What's that? The place you're talking about is the wedding photo shoot. The gray cat patted Silen's forehead in dissatisfaction. Let's test your eyesight. Silen pointed to the person who was taking pictures of the wedding dress. With the place where the bride is standing as the center and a radius of 100 meters, how many butterfly bees are there in this circular area? 169. Hui Mao answered almost immediately. Among them, 132 are carbon-based creatures and 37 are mechanical camouflage. After a pause, Hui Mao continued. Among the 37 mechanical camouflage bees, 7 are monitoring the few people taking the wedding photo, 10 are monitoring the surroundings, including us, and 20 are facing the direction of Tang Kikikyu and young Master Tabu. With just a glance, Hui Mao could distinguish the butterfly bees that looked the same to others. Although the disguised mechanical butterfly bees were fine with the other butterfly bees beside them. In Hui Mao's eyes, there was a world of difference between carbon-based creatures and mechanical objects. He could tell with just a glance. There were no surveillance devices installed in the floats. It seemed like the Fenier's family was very concerned about the privacy of their passengers, but in reality, they had other ways to monitor them. Not bad. Not bad. Silen nodded. Of course. Look at who's doing it. Silen interrupted Hui Mao's self-improvement. Then have you noticed which mechanical camouflage bees have microweapon systems? Hui Mao's ears twitched, and he jumped from Silen's head to the table. If one paid attention to Hui Mao's eyes, one would notice that his pupils were greatly dilated as he looked out the window. Calm monitoring, communication monitoring, gene-level analysis, laser scanning, high-density energy stimulation beam. Hui Mao listed a few of the systems on the camouflage butterfly bees. Meow. There's even a self-destruct mechanism. Hui Mao's beard moved as he looked at Silen. I wouldn't have known if I didn't look. Other than the camouflage mechanical butterfly bees, there are also many mechanical camouflage bees in the flowers and underground soil. I just saw a mechanical camouflage earthworm and a few mechanical ants. Don't they have too many spies? Doesn't this mean that our every move is being monitored? That's true. The Fenier's family has a lot of protective surveillance, but it's not necessarily a bad thing for us. Silen tugged at Hui Mao's beard. What did you see? That's right. Although there were mechanical camouflage bees everywhere monitoring everyone's every move, it was also a lot more convenient for Hui Mao. This was because he could see the surveillance feed of these camouflage bees without being discovered by the Fenier's family. Wo meow. They're actually kissing in public. Hui Mao yelled. In another float 50 meters away from the one Silen was sitting on, a young couple was having sex. Originally, it couldn't be seen from the perspective of Silen's float, but Hui Mao saw it through the surveillance feed of the camouflage butterfly bee. The young couple didn't think that anyone would notice their actions. Although they couldn't see anyone else from the window, their every move was still known by certain people. Yo, that girl's skirt has a slit. Seeing that Hui Mao was becoming more and more frivolous, Silen slapped him. Look at how Chio and the others are doing. Chio is playing a game. That young Master Tubu is slamming the table. He looks very angry and is even yelling loudly, but Chio is ignoring him. In another float not far away, Costella and a person who looked like a bodyguard were sitting inside. Is everything ready? Costella asked with his eyes half closed. Everything is ready. However, according to the information we received, there might be some movement on the other side. Isn't this too risky? After all, the young master is following us. Costella sighed. There's no other way. This is the old man's wish. We can only do our best. If we don't run into the people on the other side, and everything goes smoothly, of course, that's a good thing. If we do run into them, We can only do our best to keep the young master away from danger. Please don't worry. We will definitely do our best to protect the young master. However, the people from Vanguard, you don't have to worry about that. I have my own plans." Under young Master Tobo's repeated urging, Costella finally ordered his subordinates to prepare to depart. This time, they were escorted by 3 corvettes on their return journey. Although it was not as impressive as when they had first arrived, it was still considered a large scale compared to the others. The 3 corvettes formed a triangle around the starship that Tobo was on. Scylla was also on this starship. However, in order to avoid arousing suspicion and to abide by certain terms of the agreement, Scylla and Tang Qiuqiu did not have much contact during this period of time. After all, Scylla did not directly accept this protection mission. Tang Qiuqiu continued to play with her game, console, every day. As for Tobo, because he lost to Tang Qiuqiu in a shooting competition, he had been practicing his marksmanship on the starship. However, no matter how much he practiced, Tang Qiuqiu only had one sentence to say: "Stupid as hell." She had completely copied Scylla's evaluation of Hui Mao and the tone of voice when she spoke. The 4 starships did not run into any accidents along the way. It was fairly peaceful, and their next destination was not Sector F. Instead, it was Sector H that they would pass through halfway. There was a Phoenier's family branch base there, and it was also the administrative center of the entire Sector H. Costella said that he had received orders to go there and would be delayed for 2 or 3 days. However, young Master Tobo did not lose his temper. In fact, he was quite happy. What was the most famous thing in Sector H? Seafood. Chapter 138. There weren't many habitable planets in Sector H, but most of the planets in this region were special. Almost all of the habitable planets had more than 50% seawater, and some of the planets with rank B habitability had seawater covering almost 100% of their surface area. That was why Sector H was also called the Blue Sector. When Scylla was strolling around Seven Lights Business District, he had seen a lot of marine products brought over from Sector H. He had to admit that Sector H's marine products were better than the other sectors. Therefore, there were many business groups or great families who would obtain the development and management rights of a certain planet after they had set their eyes on it. They would use it to breed marine products and so on. The Phoenier's family was one of them. Scylla flipped through the planet introductions on the electronic star map and saw a couple of familiar planets. For example, the one called Planet Aquamarine. That planet was Seven Lights' internship planet. However, Planet Aquamarine was a little far from the planet they were going to, so they probably wouldn't run into anyone from Seven Lights. The planet they were going to this time was Sector H's planet Zafia. This planet was the central management planet of the Phoenier's family's business in the entire Sector H. Zafia, Sapphire? Scylla had read Sector H's sector language before he came here, so he understood a little about it. Zafia meant sapphire in Sector H's sector language. The name alone was enough to tell how important this planet was. Unlike the other foreign starships, the 4 starships did not need to undergo safety checks at the spaceport. After they stopped at the spaceport and docked with the space station, a specialized spaceplane would escort Tobo and the others into the planet. At the same time, there were many escort space planes and fighters that came out of the spaceport accompanying them. At the same time, their landing spot was different from the other foreign space planes. They landed at a special landing spot, and there were already people waiting around the landing spot on the ground. Scylla was a little speechless as he looked at the formation around the space planes. They needed to hire bodyguards for this kind of formation, but if they really needed bodyguards, then the ones who would be taking action would be their internal personnel. Otherwise, with the Phoenier's family's personality, how would outsiders even have the chance to approach them? Tobo, my dear little nephew, it's a pleasure to see you again. A dignified, middle-aged man walked over with a kind smile and picked Tobo up. However, his beloved nephew didn't have a good expression on his face. He pushed away the stubbled mouth and said, "Second uncle, you haven't shaved yet." Kirk smiled and tossed Tobo into the air twice before putting him down. Tobo was obviously used to this kind of greeting, so he just kept silent with a long face. After putting Tobo down, Kirk nodded at Costella. "You've worked hard." Costella, on the other hand, was well-mannered. He bowed and said, "This is what I should do." The person Tobo called second uncle was called Phineas Kirk. He was the #1 administrator of Planet Zaphia and the CEO of the Phineas family in Sector H. Sillin had searched for some information regarding the Phineas family at Sector H before he came here. Phineas Kirk appeared quite frequently in some business magazines with high contribution points. Right now, Phineas Kirk wasn't as sharp as he appeared on the magazine. He looked a lot gentler, but this was only when he was facing Tobo and Costella. Kirk's gaze when he looked at other people might not be as sharp, but it was still imposing and intimidating. It gave people the feeling of stopping at the sight of him. As the CEO of a family's business management in a major sector, it could be seen just how important Kirk's position in the Phineas family was. However, even this CEO of a major sector did not put on any airs in front of Costella. In fact, he was mostly respectful. This was something that Sillin could see very clearly. It seemed that Costella's position in the Phineas family wasn't simple. Who's this little girl? Tobo, you're already flirting outside at such a young age. As expected of your father's son. Kirk winked at Tobo. Tobo's father was famous for his philandering ways before he got married. Tobo's face was red from holding back. Who would fall for an ugly freak with a bad temper? Of course not. She's very cute. I think she's much prettier than some family's little princess. She also has my favorite blue eyes. As for her bad temper, that was even more out of the question. Who would have a worse temper than a young master like you? However, Kirk did not say this out loud. If he did, Tobo would definitely explode on the spot. However, when Kirk looked at Tang Kikikyu playfully, this CEO of a major sector couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. When Kirk looked over, Tang Kikikyu also looked at him. However, what surprised Kirk was that Tang Chiochio's gaze was too emotionless. It didn't look like something a girl of her age should have at all. Normally, a girl of her age would be shy, angry, and awkward after hearing Kirk's teasing, wouldn't she? Although Kirk did not feel any killing intent from Tang Chiochio, he felt that if the environment was different and the scene was different, this little girl might just pull out a gun and shoot him with an expressionless face. A sense of uneasiness that shouldn't appear on a little girl of her age caused Kirk's eyes to flash for a moment. He straightened his body and swept his surroundings once. Kirk's gaze paused on Sillin for a moment before he withdrew his gaze. During this process, Kirk and Costella had exchanged a brief look with each other. They didn't need to say much to know what the other wanted to express with just a look, and it also meant that the two were very familiar with each other. Sillin's first feeling was that Kirk wasn't their target, and that he wasn't the one who was going to attack Tobo. His second feeling was that the person who was going to attack Tobo was definitely on this planet. Then, as the Phineas family's headquarters in Sector H, who was the person who would choose to attack here? But Huimao wasn't in the mood to pay attention to these things. After he exited the spaceplane, he kept taking deep breaths. There was the smell of the sea in the air, and there was also the smell of fish within it. This was truly a heavenly place. Kirk brought Tobo and the others to his private residence. It was also a large manor, and although it wasn't as colorful as the manor in Little Garden, it was still a refreshing sight to behold. There were all kinds of colors ranging from light blue to dark blue, and there were even conches embedded in some places. When the wind blew, they would let out soft humming sounds of different tones. There were also wind chimes made from all kinds of shells that tinkled crisply and added a hint of liveliness to the atmosphere. Due to the unique layout, the entire manor was filled with the smell of the sea. After walking into the manor, Sillin discovered that there were guests visiting the manor since a long time ago. 2 children, a boy and a girl, who looked to be around 8 or 9 years old, skipped over and said, "Tobo, you're finally here. We've been waiting for you for a few days." It looked like these 2 children were old acquaintances of Tobo, and Tobo's face that had been sullen all this time finally smiled. "Why are you guys here?" Tobo ran over to the 2 children and huddled together. When Sillin passed by the 2 children, an indecipherable look flashed across his eyes. Before he entered the house, he looked at Costella, who was walking in front of him, and Costella just so happened to turn his head to look at him. After making eye contact with Scylla, Costello lowered his eyelids, turned around, and continued walking forward. So that's how it is. Now Scylla finally understood why the Fenrir's family, who had never hired a hunter as their personal bodyguard, would hire Tang Kikikiu as Tobo's personal bodyguard. However, right now, Scylla's confidence in Tang Kikikiu had grown a little more. After all, it was much easier to get used to a game she had already played.